Today, I'm speaking with Toby Ord, senior researcher at Oxford University's AI Governance Initiative and the author of The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity. Welcome back to the show, Toby. I think it's your fifth appearance.
It's great to be back.
It feels like today everyone is talking about recursive self-improvement, or at least like everyone in my circles is talking about AI, recursive self-improvement. Do you think that RSI will lead to an intelligence explosion, or like a massive takeoff in AI capabilities?
No. At least,
Go on.
At least I think that it's unlikely. However, the chance that it might happen, I think, is credible, and this possibility really is one of the biggest issues in AI at the moment.
So why do you think it probably won't work or won't pack much of a punch?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. One is that I think that AI research involves a lot more than just programming. And a lot more than just running the kinds of simple experiments that have been automated so far. So I think that there's a pretty reasonable chance that some major breakthroughs are still needed, and that the AI assistance isn't going to be able to provide that.
What if AIs do get better such that they can more comprehensively replace the work that staff at the companies are doing?
Well, there's a lot of different types of work at a company, and I think that this includes, say, cleaning and catering, also programming, and other aspects of software engineering, and then kind of running some simple experiments. But it also includes, I think, genuine strategic decision making, and also AI research. That is not the case of programming where you know what you want and then you type it in, but a case of you don't know what you want. You don't know what changes to these basic architectures will lead to solving some of these long-standing issues and kind of really letting these systems take off. And there's not much evidence at the moment that AI systems can do that kind of thing. They might be able to really speed up the programming, but even if they made programming instantaneous, I think that that may not actually change the timelines all that much. So they really would need to be able to help with these harder aspects of research.
Is that the crux of the issue? If they could replace human researchers, like the full suite of things that the staff are doing, do you think then we would get an intelligence explosion?
I think it's quite plausible. There's still some other issues. So when you think of an intelligence explosion, you tend to think that this rate of progress over time is kind of bending upwards in some way. But most people think that then it will eventually kind of plateau off. And so it will start to bend back down as you reach some kind of limit, or maybe the kind of increasing complexity of the system starts to overwhelm your ability to improve it. And so most people think it will bend back down to flatten off. And so the real question is, before that, is there a phase where it's bending upwards? Or is it just the phase that's flattening off? And I don't think that it's clear which one of those it is, even if it could replace all of the human skills.
What are the most distinctive aspects of recursive self-improvement that make it different than humans doing the work?
Yeah, so there's an interestingly long history of talking about recursive self-improvement. Quite a few decades of talking about it, followed by now we're at the situation where a lot of people are suggesting, that they're doing it. And so, this started famously with I.J. Good, who talked about this possibility of an ultra-intelligent machine. And what I think a lot of people forget about his story of recursive self-improvement, although he didn't use that term, he used the term intelligence explosion. He was thinking of an AI system, once you have an ultra-intelligent machine, one that's more, outside the human range, is kind of beyond anything that a human can do. And in fact, it's beyond what the entire research community can do. Once you've got that point, he said that this is the last invention you need ever make because it would be better at everything, by definition. And one of those things is building more intelligent AI systems. And so he thought that this would lead to this ultra-intelligent machine builds an ultra-intelligent machine number 2, which then builds number 3, and so on. And that this would have an explosion, leaving humanity far behind, although perhaps it would also peter out at some very high level. So that was the first idea. And then there's a kind of a big change to it by Eliezer Yudkowsky around about the year 2000, where what he considered was, maybe you don't need it to be ultra-intelligent to start this off. So in I.J. Good's version, the AI community have had to get all the way up to ultra-intelligent machines without any recursive self-improvement. But in Yudkowsky's version, he thought, well, maybe if the one thing the system was good at was improving its own code, then you could have a system that's below the human level and easier to build. But then it keeps improving itself, and then it works out, now that it's so good at improving its own code, it works out how to improve other aspects of itself, and then can ultimately kind of blossom into this kind of full set of capabilities at some very advanced level. But his version still involved this idea that it was a bit like AI improver, is say your program written in Lisp or some other kind of symbolic system, and then you run like AI improver on the source code of AI improver, and you put that in a loop, and then you hit return, and then this thing kind of whirs away and improves itself like 1,000 times, like say over the next day, and then you've got this super intelligent system with no real opportunity for humans to be in the picture anymore. Okay, so they're the previous versions. And then the modern conception, that the labs are talking about now, it's more like you've got this kind of companies with thousands of human researchers and programmers, and also they're building AI. And so far, the AI's abilities, depend upon what these researchers do. But we could have a little bit of kind of input from the AI itself, where it kind of feeds back in this kind of feedback loop. So for example, at DeepMind, they developed an AI system that found a slightly faster matrix multiply algorithm. So then the new chips for the next generation of AI could be, I don't know, like 1 part in 1,000 faster or something. It wasn't that big a deal, but it was interesting. And that was kind of like a first stage where the AI kind of like improved its successor. And there have been a few other things like this. The most notable these days is the AI coding systems that could take on a whole lot of the coding responsibilities for creating the next AI. But we've got a system there where there's humans and AI together, and the AI is not like way below the human level. It's not way above. It's kind of somewhere on the kind of lower outskirts of the human level at a lot of things. And it begins by inputting a small amount into the process, but that amount could increase and increase and increase until it's mainly driving the process.
Yeah. So I think the companies imagine it now as a gradual process of replacing their staff, where it's gradually the AI is going to be able to do more and more of all of the things that the humans were doing. But I guess at the moment, the AIs and the humans are incredibly closely integrated. They're working together basically as colleagues, because there's lots of things that one can do that the other can't, and vice versa. What implications does that have that maybe like shift people's expectations relative to, I think like so much of this conversation has been informed in a way that people don't always appreciate by the Eliezer Yudkowsky vision that has been like so dominant in, I guess, shaping, I don't know, the stories that people tell about how it's going to play out. But if it's not playing out that way, like why is it different?
Yeah, so I think the biggest change is one with respect to safety, which is that there's much more of an opportunity for humans to remain in the loop. I remember noticing, back, 15 years ago with the Yudkowsky story that he had this, compelling vision about why AI could be really dangerous. And at some point, I noticed that so much of the danger was coming from this recursive self-improvement concept. And I remember thinking maybe there should be a moratorium on this, about 15 years ago. But it was outside the Overton window to talk about not doing this thing that no one could do. So it's a little bit hard to get these things off the ground when you're too early. But yeah, it was driving a lot of the risk because it was this thing where you had to get everything absolutely right. You'd had to kind of like understand human values and be motivated by them, at the point where you start this process. And he was imagining a system that can't even speak English at the point where you start the process. So like, how do you, write some, you write this kind of like English text that like once it's halfway up, it then can read it and then it kind of, tries to act on that and so on. But really dangerous without being able to have any way to kind of interact with the system, once it's going. No ability to learn from feedback for us. Whereas this new version is substantially more gradual, but also it has a lot more opportunities to understand what's happening. We even have, interpretability tools to try to understand what's going on inside the systems, while they're climbing up this approach. So I think that it does look somewhat safer than these old versions.
Something that I find quite frustrating feels like, I guess, I and my colleagues have been thinking about this for years now, the recursive self-improvement possibility. It feels like we've gotten almost no greater clarity on how fast it's going to go and at what level it will plateau. Did you also have that view that we don't know whether it will work, we don't know how long it will last, and we don't really know at what level it's gonna cut out or peter out if it does work?
Yeah, that's right. I'm actually working on a paper at the moment, trying to understand these possibilities of really explosive growth, which I do think is is credible. And that, I'm concerned about it. But a lot of that, is trying to understand the dynamics. And is this the kind of explosive growth that's exponential? Or is it the kind of thing that is faster than an exponential, such that it would have this kind of vertical asymptote where there's a particular time at which the level of this intelligence goes to infinity? That kind of dynamic, as opposed to the more typical compounding exponential growth from populations and things. And so some of the debate is over that. But even when you're debating that kind of question, almost everyone in this area thinks that the intelligence is going to cap out at some particular maximum level anyway. And so to some extent, the exact shape of it, may end up being kind of moot. If it caps out not that much above where it currently is, for example, or there's these questions of, sure, it's an exponential, but is the doubling time on the exponential like a week or is it a decade? That's a big deal. And often the theoretical analysis doesn't shed much light on that. So one of my colleagues, Tom Davidson, has great work on this, great theoretical work, where he's looking at all these questions about the theory of it, and will it have this vertical asymptote, which gets called a mathematical singularity, not to be confused with the kind of more sci-fi concept of the singularity, although maybe they could be related. But then his kind of bottom line is saying something like, he thinks that it's most likely that there'll be something like 5 years of AI research, progress that happens within 1 calendar year, and then it starts to plateau, something like that. And it's like, all of this stuff about does it go to infinity or does it do this thing? And, in the limit as time, goes on forever, what happens to it? And then it kind of comes down to some little rule of thumb, like could go 5 times faster for a bit or something.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't want to I mean, it would be quite a hectic year, I suppose, if we had like 5 years of like past AI progress compressed into one. But I suppose it doesn't feel like it's impossible that we would be able to manage that.
No. And it also depends on where that leaves us. Suppose we had the previous 5 years compressed into 1 year. That would have been very disruptive. If we, all from pre-ChatGPT through to where we are now. But it would leave us at a point with a somewhat manageable technology. And so it's not clear exactly where this thing does plateau. It might plateau at a point that is, that is not vastly superhuman and that is controllable. Or it might be that the 5 years takes us through that period where things get out of control. And I think that would be a big deal. Obviously, the 5 years itself is just guesswork. But
you said that you thought. In the picture that people have had historically, much of the risk came from recursive self-improvement. Why is that distinctively risky? And do those types of risks carry forward to the kind of recursive self-improvement that we might see in the next few years?
Yeah, so if I cast my mind back to how this has been thought about before large language models, part of it was that there was this kind of question that got called the value loading question, where if you take kind of like the richness of human values and all the things we care about, and the way that if you kind of miss out important aspects of the human condition, that it could lead to this impoverished future, that is dystopian in some way. As Stuart Russell was one of the few people who predicted that what happened, which was that the AI system has read all of the books we've ever written, which are, millions of pages of text, like on almost all pages, someone is judging some other human, some humans judging some other human about something, whether it's Lizzie Bennett judging Mr. Darcy or what have you. And so you can learn like vast amounts about this. And that was outside of the previous conception because it was going to happen so quickly that it wasn't clear there was any kind of moment where you could kind of, get it to understand what we care about. And also that's kind of one aspect, but maybe the broader aspect is that kind of feedback, some ability to actually say, if you've got some experiment, the experiment's going off the rails, quickly, pull the emergency stop button or something like that, or to learn other aspects about, how it's progressing and to then kind of be attentive to them. Maybe if you're planting a tree, or in your garden that you've never planted before, if you can go out every day and check on it and kind of, see that its leaves are wilting a little bit and kind of adjust and so on, it's a lot easier to make that tree survive than if you had to build a machine that will, appropriately measure out water for it every day or something and just turn that machine on and hope the whole thing works.
Okay, so that's the risk that stood out to people 15 years ago. I guess what's the picture now?
Yeah, so now there's a few different kinds of risks that come from this. I think the fundamental thing is that everything's going a lot faster. That's where a lot of the risk would come from. Ultimately, speed itself is not quite the risk. Although if it did bring forward some apocalypse by a few years, then all our lives would be shortened by a few years, which would actually be a pretty big deal. But it's probably even bigger than that, because what would happen is it would change the probability that things go off the rails and that we get a bad outcome. And the way that it could do that through sheer speed is that it could change like the speed of the AI activities that are increasing risk, such as improving the capabilities of these systems faster. Like, you could make more of an impact on that than it makes on like some of the processes that are reducing the risk, such as technical research on AI alignment, or or other aspects like AI governance work. I don't think it's going to speed those things up as much as it would speed up the capabilities work of improving its own capabilities. So if these things get out of whack, then what you'd expect is that for any particular level of capable AI systems, that our ability to control them is lagging behind. So we'd kind of pass through all of these thresholds less prepared than we otherwise would be.
Yeah. So I'm not is recursive self-improvement itself risky above and beyond the fact that it speeds things up? I guess I feel quite unsure about this, and it seems like people disagree at the companies and outside of them. Imagine that it didn't speed things up. I guess the obvious way that it's more dangerous is that the AIs are doing the work themselves, and so it's like more difficult to monitor someone else doing something than to be doing it yourself. Is there more to it than that?
Yeah, so let's call that the second one, second source of risk. So if you imagine like producing, one AI system, let's call it GPT-7, and then that produces GPT-8, which produces GPT-9 and 10 and so on. That if any of those in that line were to be misaligned and to be able to scheme about what they want to achieve, then they would have an incentive to misalign the systems that they were building, and to make sure that whatever its kind of like peculiar objectives were that differ from human objectives, that was maintained in the future systems. So that's like the second kind of big source of risk, which is also a really big deal independently from the first, and it could have different remedies for it. Like if you look at each of these different ways that recursive self-improvement could be risky, there could be different forms of governance or different kinds of rules applied at the labs in order to manage them. So then a third one would be that like when humans create a new technology, say guns, first we create muskets, and then we make rifles, and then eventually we've got handguns and machine guns and things like this. And we've got this opportunity though to learn from the intermediate stages. So we don't unleash like the most powerful form of the technology on society all at once. Or with cars, we had like much slower cars before they could, go at the current speeds. And so that gave us like opportunities to learn. Also, there was only a few of them around at first, instead of like everyone having a car. And so having those kinds of intermediate levels is like extremely useful for society. We're actually really quite bad at predicting what's going to happen if some new technology were to arrive and to regulate it in advance. But if we get to witness some of the ill effects on a smaller scale, then we can learn from that. And so in this case, if things are going, let's say they're going 5 times faster, maybe instead of, it being the model that would have been released in 2027, in 2027, we get the model that would have been released in 2032 or something. And so we have like some really big jump up there. If we get that, we don't get the opportunity to learn from these intermediate things. And it could be that there's one that really would have created a lot of havoc, but at a level that was ultimately manageable by society, but we really learned our lesson. And in this case, we might not get to learn that lesson.
Yeah. Is there a fourth one?
Yeah. So I think a fourth area is that if you kind of imagine, the rate of progress just with human-only research in AI. Let's say that's kind of ticking along. And then imagine that there's a leading lab where their research is kind of improving, the capabilities over time. And then there's a trailing lab that's a year behind them. The difference in the capabilities of the leading lab and the trailing lab, it's noticeable, but it's only only so big. Whereas if you have this recursive self-improvement and the capabilities like really bend upwards steeply at some point, then the first lab to go through that process, it could be that, if we go with Tom Davidson's rule of thumb of 5 years of progress in 1 year, it will be then 5 years ahead on the old scheme of where the lab that was a year behind is. And so that is more likely to lead to a kind of winner-take-all scenario, which encourages racing, and also to lead to a final outcome where there's much more concentration of power towards whoever gets there first. So I think that's like a fourth reason. There's probably more. I'm hoping that people will take up this idea of okay, actually, let's try to think about this and try to work out what are the different sources of danger, and then what kind of remedies would be required to deal with them, how much danger are they producing, and so on.
I think people who are very skeptical that there will be any slowdown, the argument that they most lean on is just the competition between the US and China, and the distrust between the countries will make it impractical to delay the arrival of things. It's going to, if anything, inspire the government to want to push forward to superintelligence as quickly as possible in order to avoid being, vulnerable to the country that they see as partially an adversary. Do you think an agreement between the US and China is more likely than those folks believe?
Yeah, I think at least in the long run, I think it is quite credible. In this short run, so could there be a deal between China and the US on recursive self-improvement, and how would that work? I haven't thought about that one too much, but that could be a bit harder. So it does depend on the nature of the deal. But if the idea was something more like a moratorium on superintelligence, that we're willing to go a certain distance into the world of AI and AGI, but that systems that completely dwarf the intellectual powers of humans are off limits, I think that such a deal would be very much in the interests of both countries from the perspective of AI risk. That once they realize that there's a very credible chance that by allowing these things that they will be killed, and that their children will be killed, and their whole culture kind of erased from the earth, perhaps, that will If that is what the evidence suggests, then if people ultimately wake up to the evidence, I think it's just in their own interests generally, in order to, if they can, to negotiate some way to not go there.
So the game theory is a lot easier if both governments basically are extremely scared of superintelligence, and they think the risk posed by the AI itself, or the risk posed by AI advances, is large relative to the risk posed by the adversary country that they're worried about falling behind against. But I'm not necessarily sure that the countries will end up having being as scared of AI as that to make such an agreement easy.
Yeah, well, I think that it's pretty likely that they will be. So at the moment, it's only people who are looking out quite far ahead who can see some of these possibilities clearly and are willing to kind of trust some of this extrapolation about what's going on, and that's only a subset of people. But I think of it like with COVID, where I remember, partly by reading some of your writing on it at the time, really tracking this early on and being, very much ahead of the curve, and really kind of looking at these graphs and working out how many cases there really were and so on. And overall, I would say this just brought me I was 2 weeks ahead of everyone else. And so there were things that I was deciding, for example, to cancel my book tour for my going to America for my book. But 2 weeks later, it was just totally obvious. And anyone would realize that you have to cancel it. In fact, planes might not have even been flying at that point. And so I think there's something here where for us to see now that in 2030 or something, that these systems could be extremely dangerous requires something of a leap of logic or something. But to see that as we approach it will become increasingly obvious. And so if we approach it gradually enough, such that before they're at the level where they could take over the world if they wanted to, they're at a level where they could do other amazing things at a similar level to taking over the world. And then before that, they're just a little bit below that, and so on. Then it should be actually pretty obvious to people. You don't have to look into the future; you just have to look into the present, really. So I think that we neglect that. We think it's a kind of a rare combination of things to really kind of take ideas seriously is needed. But I think that won't be needed. And in fact, just the kind of natural like with COVID, just the natural self-preservation instinct of I don't want to die, I don't want my children to die, will kick in and will be enough actually. So it partly depends on the gradualness, but it will. I don't know whether that will quite be enough, but it will definitely make it easier and easier over time to see where this is heading, if it really is heading there.
Yeah, the other pushback I get on this notion is, firstly, I guess if you talk to people who have done negotiations with China or been involved in that kind of diplomacy, they're just on the US side, they're unbelievably jaded. They feel like there's a lot of bad faith on the Chinese side. That it's very hard to get them to like sincerely agree to anything and follow through on it. And it wouldn't shock me if on the Chinese side there's also some like skepticism about the US's willingness to follow through on treaties. And another concern is that the NatSec community, when you describe a new incredibly dangerous thing, military people, their first impulse is not, we have to ban this. It's, we have to have this before anyone else. And I guess we kind of see that with the cyber capabilities of Mythos and Fable, that there's a certain hunger to like grab those powers ahead of anyone else. Do you think those are severe barriers?
Yeah, there's definitely a barrier. But, reading, say, Situational Awareness by Leopold Aschenbrenner, couple of years ago when that came out, it painted a very hawkish picture of America kind of, maintaining its advantage on AI and using that in order to be able to disarm and kind of subjugate China, which might have seemed very attractive to hawkish people in the administration. But if you think of it from China's perspective, suppose that there is a technology that will mean that you can unilaterally just disarm this other superpower. But possibly have regime change and so on, and finally be able to get all of your policy objectives, at this international level with them. Then China would be in a position where its nuclear arsenal, the value of it goes to zero at the time when that system's turned on. And so, if so, there's like a strong incentive to threaten nuclear retaliation for them to even cross lines, like approaching that level of power over them. And so, I think that this alternative strategy to having some kind of moratorium, the strategy of no, we get there first and then we kind of lord it over them and use that to disarm them, I think doesn't really work because of this issue. It's actually very similar to the situation when Ronald Reagan was doing this Star Wars program to defend against a missile defense shield against Soviet missiles, where again, once you turn on that shield, it sounds defensive, but once you have that shield, all of a sudden, the value of the Soviet nuclear missiles goes to zero. And so they're strongly incentivized to strike before you do that. And so all of a sudden, you're creating this kind of first strike incentive. So I think that is not a good strategy, actually, because it's failing to take into account what's the best response to this strategy, which is ultimately threatening nuclear war. So I don't think that you can actually just seize this technology, at least not if your opponent's paying attention. You could maybe only do it if they just don't realize that the option's available to them or something. But that's usually when Rand or other senior people give strategic advice. They assume like best response from the opponents. They try to take this game theoretic approach of like, we're assuming that they're not an idiot. What should you do? Whereas I feel that in this case, it's a little bit like moving your queen somewhere where there is a kind of subtle way that the queen could get taken, but you just hope they don't see it. And that's not how this advice normally actually works. And I think that there's been a failure to consider best response. So I think that counter to the idea of no one should get this, of no, we should get it. First, I think kind of doesn't really work as well as people think.
I guess especially not when you're shouting about it in the press, and an extremely easy way to pick up.
Exactly, and it's almost like, so move the queen here, like it can be taken, or but we're hoping they won't see it.
We'll write about it in the New York Times, but we hope they won't read it.
Exactly. I mean, I've heard that there are 5 different Chinese translations of that essay, for example. So they've definitely heard it, and so. So I think that approach of we just get there first and then have all the power at the world stage, I think is overrated. And then there's also these questions of is it possible to verify it and so on, right? How do we trust them? And the jaded negotiators. I mean, it is a problem that they're feeling like that. But I think that they're jaded on discussing a whole lot of issues that are a lot less important than this. So that I would say this issue to those negotiators is more than 100 times as important as any issue they've ever negotiated before, right? If the negotiator was told you get killed if you don't succeed in this negotiation, they'll be like, oh my God, like they won't be feeling jaded at that point, right? They'll be feeling, if anything, a little bit too excitable or something. And so because the stakes become really high, and it's very much in their interest to actually reach some kind of agreement, I think that it can push through that barrier. But there are these questions about like how would you make sure that they're holding up their end of the bargain? I think that the key aspect that you would need is basically to get China and the US for it to be in their interests to have such an agreement if it could be verified. And I think it is, and I think that they will start to see that as we get closer. And then we also need an ability to make the agreement actually bind them. And then they could police their own spheres of influence. So you might not have to get like, everyone else on board at first. And so the kind of key step, I guess, is the verification.
Yeah. How would you do the verification, do you think?
Yeah. So I think there's a bunch of ways to do it, and it depends on exactly what the technology is at the time and so on. People have often been thinking about some very technologically advanced verification mechanisms, such as having, the next version of the NVIDIA chips, be able to know exactly where they are in the world with GPS. And if someone blocks the GPS, then maybe the chip shuts down. It will only start working again if it can, if it can share where it is and so on. I mean, that would be great if we get those things. Then, for example, there would be credible ways to prove that your chips aren't actually working on these, on advancing AI further. But even, I think people forget that there's just the universe of possible ways of doing verification is very large. And I think the Cold War is like really illustrative. So for example, in, one of the key things was that the US and the USSR wanted to reduce the number of nuclear capable bombers that could threaten the other person's like home soil. And so what they did eventually, some bright person worked out, like thinking outside the box, worked out that they could they put these bombers were on the runway, that they could saw them in half with like a huge kind of circular saw. Yeah. And then with tractors, like pull the halves apart from each other. And so that spy planes from the opposing side could witness this and just like credibly see the destructive like capacity be destroyed. And then those, as far as I understand, those planes are still on the runways in halves. Because someone was like, well, hang on, this is a way you could do it. And so I think at the moment, that's the kind of thing you come up with after you've been thinking about this for quite a long time. Whereas at the moment, there's a lot of people who've thought about it for less than one day, like less than 8 hours full time, thinking about is verification possible, who say, oh, it's probably impossible. And so I guess we will all die, or we'll, and I feel that is a bit of a ridiculous approach. I mean, it's reasonable to think it might be impossible to do the verification. Maybe we'll think about it for years and we won't find any ways. But I think that there are a lot of credible ways. And that's an example that you couldn't have initially done that, right? It required the Overton window to move a bit before that one was possible, for the US to say, this will literally involve destroying capacity we've already built. And that would have been annoying at first. But once they realized that it would also destroy us the same amount of capacity on the other side, you start to think, you know what, even though we've already built it, it's probably worth doing. So I think an example that would be very analogous to that is at the moment, there's a lot of chips that aren't being tracked, and where we don't know exactly how many have been smuggled into China and things like that. But you could have, say, like for like, destruction of that capacity. So as a kind of simple example, you could say, the US, agrees to bring 1 million GPUs or 1 million H100 equivalents worth of GPUs to Geneva, and China will bring 1 million there as well. And what they'll do is they'll both test each other's GPUs to make sure they all work. And then they'll both destroy them, would be the simple version, but probably you could do better than that and just both put them into escrow. For example, that compute is now being used by, for some kind of humanitarian purpose by an international organization that they both kind of have people on the ground,
and anyone can inspect what's going on.
Exactly. So, but there are ways like that where even if you don't know exactly how many chips they have and so on, you could at the very least do one-for-one kind of like swap-offs like this. And that's the kind of thing, you come up with like one person just thinking for a while about it. I'm sure there's like, much smarter approaches you could do as well. So I do think that we just haven't spent much time at all thinking about like ways to verify once the Overton window is broad enough. So that idea,
once people are really motivated,
so that idea, I think now we're at the stage where at least maybe some of the people listening to this will think, oh yeah, I guess you could do that, and maybe some other people will be thinking that's insane to destroy this or to give away these GPUs to this neutral party. But I think it's the kind of thing that you can now think of as like, yeah, I guess you could do that. Whereas 5 or 10 years ago, you kind of couldn't even really think about that. And as we get closer, I think just more and more things, will start to seem like, well, hang on, if the alternative is that my children get killed, I guess I'm prepared to do this thing. Like it didn't sound great at first, but now that you point out like seriously bad alternatives, is it better than that? And that the answer will be like, yeah, it was way better than that.
I feel like the distinctive Toby Ord perspective over the last couple of years has been, what if society does realize or like come to think this is a very serious issue, it's a very big threat, and what if they're not idiots about it, and what if they like do the sensible thing? It's surprising that has been like quite a contrarian take or quite a contrarian expectation, and not many people like imagining, well, how would that play out? I guess it also requires that things be a bit gradual and things not be like really explosive.
I mean, this is another thing that goes back to that Yudkowsky kind of idea of an intelligence explosion that's completely automated and happens really quickly. So because of that, he was imagining, when he first started kind of ringing the alarm bells about AI risk, that it would happen, like it would take you from a system that was only of academic interest to a system that could take over the world if it wanted to, without humanity waking up to that outside of like some narrow part of the research community. Whereas what we've had is something kind of much more steady, where the intermediate phases are visible. And I guess it's related to this idea that humanity is actually okay at learning from feedback. Like once we try things and we find out that they're bad for us, that, we can adjust our course. And so because things have ended up being more continuous than that, and perhaps they will remain so, you can then anticipate that that these opportunities will arise. Whereas recursive self-improvement, one of the problems is it may mean that we go from systems that are quite impressive but not amazing to systems that are all powerful without that being visible. And if so, then we're back. we're back in the world where But I do think that a lot of people aren't thinking quite seriously enough about how easy it will be to notice these things later on.
So if we're going to have a moratorium on something, I guess, and we could imagine like multiple different levels of moratorium. It could start with just a couple of companies agreeing not to do something that they regard as a dangerous research practice, and then perhaps one government can get involved, and then you could have an international treaty. I guess what should it be about, and what should it be on, and how would you potentially design it? Yeah,
I mean, my main bottom line is I don't know. I think that there are like heaps of options that are all quite interesting. When I think about recursive self-improvement, here are a couple of different things that you could do. So one of them is you could say there's some level of AI capabilities that we're not going to just kind of rocket through it, that it's high enough above our current levels that we would stop if we reached it. That's one approach. You could also have a kind of speed limit. You could say there's a certain amount of capability increase per year. Maybe it's the speed that's the problem. And so you could set a limit that we're not going to go faster than a certain amount. There's also ways that are somewhat arbitrary, but also verifiable. So for example, companies could say, well, we're going to do some AI coding, like every company in the world is doing AI coding. And it'd be somewhat weird if the AI companies that are making the AI that does the coding are the only companies that are not using it. But there could be a limit on how much compute can be used for that. Say that they will not use more than some very large number that's somewhat arbitrary of tokens on AI for AI R&D automation. And so they're allowed to use a whole lot of compute when training their models in the normal ways and so on. But this approach of like exactly how many tokens are there being used per researcher or something at the lab, and you could put a limit on that. And people would say, oh, why is it here? And why isn't it a little bit higher or a little bit lower? But the point would be that so long as we all agree on some particular limit, then it could actually be fairly easy to check whether, at least within Western labs, whether they're all following it or not.
What do you think are the pros and cons of trying to set a speed limit versus trying to just stop progress completely, which is something like, at least some people have suggested?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess if the idea is to stop RSI at all, like if it's some kind of moratorium about recursive self-improvement itself, then I think it's very difficult to have a thing to never get started because I feel like they've already started. And so you could say, okay, you've started and the mistake was to let you start, and now we're going to remove all of that. And there's no more AIs making better matrix multiplication algorithms, and no more AIs being used for coding of other AIs and so on. You could try to roll it back, although it's challenging to do so. In general, there's a kind of question about like which lines are legislatable and so on. And so that's one reason why I've generally been a bit of a fan of compute thresholds on things, is that I think that it's easier to write them into law and it's easier to kind of inspect them and so on. Whereas if you say you're not allowed to do anything that counts as recursive self-improvement, which is any way that you use AI in order to help with the AI R&D process, there's probably going to be a lot of like corner cases and so on that are quite hard to police on it. So that's a less good line to draw. Doesn't mean it's impossible though. It could also be that you say, yeah, it's going to be hard to work out, and what's going to happen is that if we think there's a violation, it's going to go to this set of 5 judges, and if a majority of them rule that it's a violation, then it's going to count as a violation. So you could just say, yeah, we're just going to do that, like how courts actually decide law in the real world.
So one source of benefit from a moratorium would just be slowing down progress so we have more time to learn through trial and error. I guess a different reason to have a moratorium or like some limitations on recursive self-improvement is so that you are more likely to retain a human in the loop who's monitoring what's going on and might pick up misalignment or attempted, I guess, sabotage of future models by an AI that was designing its successor. Do you have any thoughts on how you can encourage that to keep occurring?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there'll be a lot of incentive actually to keep a human in the loop. There's a couple of useful terms that came up and do get legislated in the case of lethal autonomous weapons, which are like having a human in the loop and then also having meaningful human control. And I think that they should try to do both those things in this case. I'm not sure if they're the best places to try to set the rule, but I think that there's a lot of incentive for the companies to keep humans in the loop when it comes to these things. Now, could the humans, say on the safety team, tell if the AI GPT-8 was misaligned and was kind of making a misaligned GPT-9? I don't know. It's possible that they couldn't catch it, even if it was.
At least not directly, probably, but they might be able to use other AI tools to inspect the outputs and to have them debate one another about whether they're faithful.
Yeah.
There's like various things that people have suggested.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. Like I know, when Buck was on this podcast, he listed a huge kind of array of different possible control tools, and so I wouldn't rule out that there are ways of achieving that. But it might be that all of the 4 different ways I outlined that it makes things riskier to do recursive self-improvement. It might be that having a human in the loop as one of the possible remedies doesn't help with this particular, one of these ways that things get riskier.
So back in 2023, there was a very famous letter suggesting that we should have a 6-month pause on training new, more powerful models than GPT-4. And I guess in the meantime, the request was that the companies like get their house in order and like figure out internal practices that would allow them to more safely train and release models going forward. I decided not to sign the letter at the time because I wasn't sure whether it was a good idea. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, I suppose, hindsight is 2020, but I think it would have had almost no benefits, or at least like the pausing on the training, I don't think would have been very useful because it wouldn't really have stopped progress. Compute would have continued advancing. They'd still have been able to do many types of experiments, and I think would roughly have the same capabilities now as we would have, like given that there was no pause. So given that the 2020, like in 2023, I think it would have been a mistake. There's a question. There's like why is it better now? Like, why do it in 2026? Like, why not wait until 2027 or 2028? I think there's like various things that you're trading off. One reason that it was premature in 2023 was that the models just weren't capable enough to actually be a direct threat in any particular way. So there was like no immediate risk that was being reduced. And furthermore, during the pause, the models weren't yet capable enough to assist you with alignment research, with governance research, with really anything. They, in fact, like weren't actually that useful as it turns out. So in both respects, like not very much would have been accomplished. And so in my mind, what you're doing is trying to like optimally time the point at which you have some moratorium so that you're actually reducing some direct risk that the AIs might pose. In the meantime, they can help you speed up a whole bunch of other work that you want to do, that you want to like speed up relative to AI capabilities. But you don't want to miss the boat completely. You don't want to like delay this so long that things go horribly wrong before you've had a chance to like slow them down at all, which is a difficult question. But I feel like the case that that the timing is right is stronger in 2027 than it was in 2023, and it might be stronger in 2028 than it was in 2020 than it will be in 2027. What do you make of this optimal timing issue?
Yeah, I mean, it might be stronger in 2028, or maybe it's too late.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of people who are framing it like this, where the idea is there's something like a 6-month pause. There's a certain amount of pausing capacity, let's say it's 6 months. And then the question is this optimal timing. I don't really like this framing of it. So I did sign the pause letter back then. And that's partly because it had this phrase in it. I can't remember it verbatim, but it said, as the Asilomar principles, which many leading people in AI have signed, and in fact, I was at the conference and I signed them. One of the principles was that creating artificial intelligence that surpasses humanity, in general abilities, would be one of the most monumental things to ever happen in human history, and should be planned for and kind of managed with commensurate care and effort. And I felt, hang on, I signed that, and it's obviously true. Like, you can't say no. It should be incommensurately small amount of effort compared to how grave an issue it would be, or something. And then I thought, well, what is the current level of effort? And the current level of effort in 2023 was not very high. The labs had alignment teams, but the teams were something like 10 people. And that is not a commensurate amount of effort, when thinking about something that would be one of the most transformative effects in the entirety of, 300,000 years of human history. And so I thought, actually, yeah, that's right. I signed this principle. The principle's clearly right, and the principle doesn't allow us to continue at the moment, like when we're getting into this zone. The letter did heavily mention 6 months, but it also said at least 6 months, and it kind of implied, because it said 6 months to give them time to do X, Y, and Z, and it did say at least a couple of times. So I interpreted it as it's a pause for it's not, the pause isn't ending within less than 6 months. But if you don't do these things, if it doesn't look like humanity is spending commensurate effort on this thing, then it's going to continue until humanity does. But it was a bit ambiguous. But that's the kind of thing that I'd be more in favor of. Something that's I think a pause. The way we think about we tend to think of it as a time-limited concept. That's how in discussions these days. So I think that a moratorium is perhaps a better word, that it implies, there's a kind of moral gravity of the issue. A pause kind of implies we want the thing to happen, like we want to end up at that destination. We just don't want to end up at it quite yet. Whereas I don't think it is clear that we want to end up at the destination of superintelligence, or at least not for the foreseeable future. There's some serious issues we'd have to sort out, before we perhaps condemn all future generations that could ever live, to living under perhaps the yoke of this super intelligent entities that we're unleashing into the world. And for those conversations to spread far beyond Silicon Valley, but also beyond the West, to involve people all over the world and to hear what people have to say about it. You could never get like complete, consensus or complete kind of permission to proceed with that. But kind of wanting it to be something that at least half of the people on Earth think is a good idea, as opposed to something that substantially fewer than half the people on Earth think is a good idea at the time when you launch into it. Or have even thought about it. I mean, it just seems kind of crazy from any kind of legitimacy perspective of like ushering in this thing against like the will of almost everyone. So therefore, I think some kind of a moratorium saying that's more of the format of we won't go beyond some point until some kind of standard is met, or for the foreseeable future. But people in the future are welcome to lift the moratorium if they think we're past that point, where you could just say, look, I've decided we're not going skydiving, but that doesn't rule out that maybe, your child then convinces you, by showing you a whole lot of evidence that skydiving is actually okay. And you're like, okay, skydiving's back on the menu. You're not saying forever, the sky may fall, we will never go skydiving or something. You can kind of rule something. You can say, we're making a decision not to do it. But you could revisit that decision. So I think something more like that, rather than just by default, when this amount of time elapses, we're right back at it, would be the smarter approach.
I think, if you talk about moratoriums with people at the companies, I think the thing that they immediately want to know is, well, what exactly do you want us to do while we're doing this like pause, or while we're slowing things down? What exactly is on the to-do list so that we can then release this moratorium? And I guess it's in a sense, that's good because they're the people who might have to do a bunch of this stuff. So it's natural for them to ask, well, exactly what are you requesting? But do you think what you would want to design it with that structure that you're like, well, we need to like basically tick all of these boxes, and then we'll feel comfortable, and then we'll go ahead? Or do we want to say, well, we actually don't know when we're going to feel comfortable?
Yeah, perhaps more the latter. Although gesturing at some of these boxes, I think, would be reasonable. And there have been some attempts at this. I think Yoshua Bengio has good stuff on this, suggesting that not that it would have to be absolutely impossible that the thing would go wrong, but it would meet kind of normal evidentiary standards for imposing large amounts of risks on a whole lot of strangers, or things like this, right?
Yeah.
Like that it would meet the normal standards that we apply to that. And so I think that there's ways at gesturing at it, but it could well be that we don't currently know what those set of things would be. Here's another one of these principles from the Asilomar principles, which I think have generally been forgotten, which is it said that because advanced AI systems could pose some risk of human extinction, the expected consequences of this, so like the probability multiplied by the stakes, could be colossal, and things should be planned for proportionately with those consequences. Well, if you think that there's a say a 1 in 100 risk of that, so even just 1%, so you're 99% sure it doesn't happen, so almost as confident as you could possibly be that it's going to be safe. That still, is 80 million lives in expectation, right? And which is bigger than World War II. So the expected, consequences of this thing, and that's just thinking about the one generation, not even taking into account anything about future generations. The expected consequences are bigger than a World War II. So are we putting in commensurate effort with something at the scale of a World War II in terms of, we're getting towards the perspective of putting in commensurate effort to World War II in creating the risk, right? All these people going out, building these data centers as quickly as they can and investing giant amounts of money. But in terms of actually like avoiding the risk and trying to actually pay appropriate attention to all of the human lives that could be immiserated or killed in this thing, not remotely commensurate to a World War II. And in terms of the effort, there aren't millions of people who are working on trying to avoid this thing. It's bigger than it was 10 years ago, but it's like very small. And so I signed that principle. The principle's obviously true. You can't say, no, we should have an amount of effort that's incommensurately small compared to these stakes, and the people who would be threatened by our technology. But clearly we're not meeting it. And so I think that these principles were signed by Demis Hassabis and Dario Amodei and Sam Altman and Elon Musk all signed them. They're also obviously true. You can't say, oh, back then we were so naive, we didn't realize that you should have incommensurately small efforts compared to the stakes, or something like that. Not that you can bind people or something with this, but I think that you can use that to lead a discussion. And so there was a recent kind of call for a moratorium on superintelligence, which didn't really clearly define what threshold that would be. But the point of it, and I signed that, the point was to say, here is a kind of vague area of AI systems that far surpass humanity across the board at all kind of cognitive tasks. And to say, we are not remotely ready for that. Should we begin the process of working out exactly what lines to legislate on and so on, because we definitely don't want to go there. And the idea was that people would say, yeah, we definitely don't want to go there. Exactly how far down the path we want to go is up for debate, but let's start that debate. Let's form the agreement that we don't want to go to the end of the road, and then we can work out how far along the road it would be reasonable to travel. So I think that you need to have those conversations. If people say, but why not one step further along the road or something? And they try to catch you in some little paradox or something. I feel that is missing the point. They're people who will just walk right off the cliff.
I do definitely worry that if we impose some sort of moratorium too early, that there will be a significant backlash to this, and people will view it as a failed effort, and people getting far too anxious, getting anxious far ahead of time, and this. Eventually, the moratorium would be lifted, and this would then make it more difficult to do it at the appropriate time when the actual direct risk and the ability to speed up the research that you want is much more promising. Yeah, do you worry about that?
I think it's a concern. So it could well be true. For example, one way to say what you're saying is that the longer you run the moratorium, the harder it is to keep it going or something. And so there's some kind of like counter reaction to it. Which then makes you lift it, and perhaps lift it with it blowing some steam off, like from the thing you were trying to suppress. But I think another possibility is that the longer you have the moratorium, the easier it is to keep it. And I think that that's probably right. Like if it has gone
because it's normalized. Or?
Yeah, it's normalized, and also people have stopped doing the other thing. The people who had overinvested, kind of like on this kind of extremely bullish projections about what they'd be able to do if there were no breaks, they've all written off their losses, and other people aren't champing at the bit to kind of follow them and kind of like make a whole lot of investments that turn out to not be cashable. So I think it's not clear. And so some people say, oh, it's this limited resource that we should be very careful not when we use it and so on. And in a world where it's also very hard to know when that optimal timing would be, it's not like we just know the optimal time. And also, once we say, this is it, this is the optimal time, how long will it be before it actually happens? It could be quite a while. So we might need to say, let's go now so that in a year's time, they actually do it. So I think, there's other people who say, oh, it's like a muscle that, the more you kind of practice or the more you've kind of had this moratorium, the better you'll get at it. I think that both are possible. And but we don't know. So it could backfire, and we should take that seriously as a possibility. But by the same token, it's not, there's no kind of certainty that it would backfire.
Another way that I worry it would backfire is while you're under the moratorium, unless we have a bunch of other rules as well, the supply of compute continues increasing enormously. Like we're still going to be printing lots of chips and making lots of fabs and all of that, doing further research on chip design and so on. And so at the point you later release the moratorium, you would expect a whole bunch of catch-up growth as you train bigger models, or like you now use the prohibited techniques, because like many of the underlying driving factors that were causing the progress have kind of continued underground in the meantime. And furthermore, on top of like the fact that it might go faster at the point that you release it, you would expect that if you had a moratorium on particular practices, that you might get basically a whole bunch of different actors, a whole lot of different companies converging up to the level above which you can't go. And so it'll be like a more multipolar, a more competitive situation at that point, which could give groups, I guess, even more reason to try to rush ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I don't think that's impossible. There are things, once you're worried about that, there's ways of kind of like adjusting the thing that could help deal with it. For example, if ASML stopped producing extreme UV lithography machines, it's not clear that there would be like a growth in the amount of chips that the fabs can be producing per year and so on. So there's possibly just one single company in the world who being told that they can't do the thing that they're doing, would actually stop that issue. So people often throw up their hands and like, how can you possibly deal with this? And it's like they don't realize quite how concentrated some of these skills are.
It's basically just a handful of companies. I mean, I guess it does feel like a heavy lift, at least at the moment, I suppose, to imagine this. But
again, it's the question, even if the people at these companies start to think that they'll just die if they don't, if they keep producing the things they're producing. So we'll see how far we go down that road, but it might actually not be that heavy a lift. Or again, the people who regulate them might have to just think, you know what, like...
we just got to bite the bullet.
Yeah, exactly.
I think ahead of getting any moratorium on superintelligence or RSI, I think a type of moratorium that is like plausibly on the table, like I think in the next year, is a moratorium on a particular dangerous research practice that I think many of the companies are not enthusiastic about, which is unmonitorable chain of thought. So eliminating, I guess, the ability to inspect what the models are thinking as they're reasoning about stuff. There are various research avenues you could go down that would make it impossible to read what they're saying, or at least much more difficult to read it. And I guess there's ways of making each forward pass so long that they could actually engage in like quite a substantial amount of reasoning before you saw anything that they output. I guess many different senior people in AI at different companies have said that they think this is not a great path to go down. And as far as I know, there's like no company that has like gone very far down that path. So there would be no one who'd be super disadvantaged if they all could come to the table and say, we're going to like set that one aside for now because the risk reward is just like, this is probably the worst risk reward of any of the things of any of the options that we have available. So it'll be an interesting, I guess, like step that we could take towards like beginning to limit what research practices we permit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example. Like I remember at the time when one of the papers had just come out talking about how important this was, and my response was that people should take this really seriously. That if someone creates some new method and publishes it and so on, and it gets used, that makes chain of thought illegible and gets some kind of substantial advantage out of that in terms of like capabilities, then that could be that it's possible that that's the worst piece of research that's ever been done by any human, like in terms of like, worse than inventing chemical weapons or various other things, that have happened. Like that they should really take this seriously in a kind of like, are you the kind of villain of the history books, if we even have history books? So it's a big deal, and people should be very careful about it. And that kind of this feeling it in their bones should be more common. And I think that this is an interesting case actually, because at the labs, it has started to solidify over time. I think the longer you go without someone doing it as well, the more it seems like, hang on, this is a norm, right? Like, so I think you get this kind of norm solidification, a bit similar with the nuclear taboo, where for a couple of years after the end of World War II, it was just, we're not in a major war. That's why there haven't been more nuclear weapons dropped. And then, when the Korean War kind of finished without more nuclear weapons, it was like, oh, actually, this seems to be a thing that we don't want to break it. And so, I think that a norm is kind of like growing around this, and it would be good if it was solidified. There's a lot of ways of doing that. So there have been kind of various papers, with co-authors from different labs and, things that help to try to solidify it. You can move beyond that to try to create industry best practices. That's often a way, or standards. Like, so there could be standards and best practices around not training on chain of thought that also help to delineate, some of the related issues, such as like, perhaps systems that can do more in a single forward pass, also making things less monitorable. So there's a number of different approaches. I think getting more clarity on what they all are and then kind of like building these agreements, I think that it would be great if people did more work on that, of actually bringing people around a table, really getting the people to kind of look each other in the eye and kind of realize just how important it is and how like, to build up that trust that, yes, we need to push on this and we need to get to some kind of point where we agree not to do it. Maybe it would have it possibly could have an escape valve on it in terms of, we will not do any research on this, but if someone else is out there with like, systems that have unmonitored chain of thought, then we'll do it. Or so we won't be the first to do this or something. Yeah. That could be a way that they're more happy to sign up on or something, assuming that they can actually tell if someone else has broken it. So there's definitely, I don't know the details about how hard it is to verify this one. It could actually be quite challenging. You
might require whistleblower rules, I guess.
Yeah, that could be the way to do it. But I think that would be great. I do like the example. It's like it's a smallish one, but it's like very focused, and it really does have like bad, I think, risk reward trade off and so on.
Yeah. I feel like I'd really love us to like urgently codify this because I worry that you could have some kind of rogue researcher who I guess isn't worried about any of this and just pushes ahead. And like once you know the technique is there, once it's so easy to implement, then I guess one actor might do it, and then they're like, exactly. Well, I'm taking a relative disadvantage if we now agree this.
That is indeed what they'll all be saying.
Yeah.
So it's also an interesting example because I think that things have kind of turned on, like not from everyone, but there is a kind of, it's like a lot of people don't want to train on chain of thought. They're not thinking, oh, if only we could do this like that, and get away with it or something, that would be great. But we won't because other people will. They kind of find it distasteful or something. That we've by this amazing fluke, like compared to all of the kind of thinking about this, 10, 20 years ago, the AI systems, by and large, think in English, and we can kind of observe their thoughts. Like, if you'd said that to people, 10, 20 years ago, it would be like,
seemed miraculous.
It's insane. There's no way that is true. Yeah. That what's your best verifiable, or your best,
we just read their minds.
Is like, oh, you just look at what they're thinking. It's like, really? And yet we got that. We didn't even. It wasn't even a deliberate alignment technique. I think that was something that just an absolute gift, like manna from heaven. For the people who care about the safety of this technology. And giving that up or throwing it away for suppose it's like a factor of 2 kind of compute saving or something. That's probably the kind of thing people would throw it away for. But you get factors of 2 compute saving like every couple of months, like, through some kind of, efficiency savings that, new cache rules or something like that, so. But maybe we will be so dumb as a collective kind of group to throw it away for something so small. But we should definitely try not to, and we should build in these things. And I think that once you get these norms changing, and once you get the kind of people don't even want to do it, that's, I think, maybe the key to a lot of these discussions is that lots of people are imagining, people are, champing at the bit in order to do this behavior. And they've got like all of these incentives. They make a whole lot of money, or they avoid going out of business when their rivals are getting too far ahead of them or something like that. But if you can make it so they don't want to do the behavior, if you can kind of win the moral argument that is bad, you're a bad person if you do this behavior. Like possibly one of the worst people who's ever lived, actually, if you create like this technology. That changes things.
Yeah.
And so if you ask, like, why isn't anyone cloning any humans, or like why isn't there a whole lot of genetic engineering going on, like, creating kind of like genetically superior humans? If you went back and looked at what everyone was saying, like from like, I don't know, 1880 to 1920 or something, like every kind of intellectual group was talking about eugenics, and it was just generally kind of like thought that once the capabilities were there to understand how to actually change, like, the makeup of people in future generations, that everyone would be doing it. And I think they would be pretty bewildered, like, to find out that we actually gained the abilities to do that, and then just no one's doing it. And they've said, oh, is that because you've got all these verification techniques and you're kind of like in the labs in all these different countries just making sure that no one's doing it? And it's like, no, we did this thing.
Basically, nobody wants to.
We stopped wanting to do it. It's like, well, how did you do that? And the answer is like, moral change and norms change. People really undervalue this. I think that this is a different approach to trying to use narrow incentives to try to resist the massive kind of like corporate incentives to kind of keep building more and more powerful systems. That's a really hard battle to win. But actually changing the norms so they no longer want to do something can definitely work.
Yeah, you're so idealistic, Toby. I feel like this kind of idealism is rare in AI discourse at the moment, or the idea that, well, we could just like for like moral reasons not do stuff. I don't know, but there's this like, I guess, analytical frame that people get into where it's like, well, everyone is going to just follow their incentives, do that. Yeah,
I think it's rare in the world in general to think this way, but I think it's powerful. I feel like if you were an economist and you're trying to understand, say, women's suffrage in England, back when those debates were happening, you would have thought, well, there's this currently kind of privileged class of people, men, or if you go back further, landowning men, and it's like, why would they share their franchise with other people? Like, currently they're kind of holding almost all the power. Like, why would they ever do this? And it, I think that something along the lines of it's the right thing to do is actually like a key aspect of like what made those things happen. And I feel that someone who is just kind of like predicting everyone's behaviors as kind of like narrowly self-interested, kind of psychopathic people, like in these economic models, I think they would have made bad predictions. And so what they do is then eventually they're like, oh, maybe in their utility function, one of the things they care about is like their wife.
Justice.
Or one of the things they care about is justice. Or maybe that justice gives them a warm glow, which makes them, is one of the forms of happiness. They could have a Mars bar or they could have some justice. And they have these kind of like ways of trying to incorporate it in order to make sense of something like after the fact. But they rarely like think of that in prospect when they're trying to like predict whether something will happen. But it turns out that like, why didn't I do something? Because I thought it was deeply wrong. It is like often the answer. And also that we can change what we think is wrong, and we can kind of learn that something's wrong. Or if you take, my favorite example is with the environmentalism, that up until, say, the 1950s or so, it just wasn't part of like what people thought ethics included. And then there was this kind of like, very big change over the 60s and 70s to the point where I think in the moral education at schools in Britain, it's the main moral education is kind of don't litter, don't, carbon dioxide, global warming, a whole lot of these things. They've almost they talk a lot
too far.
Maybe I think it kind of has. Like I think it is kind of part of like the moral picture, but
it's a bit overweighted, perhaps.
It's maybe a bit overweighted, but it's hard to remember like how underweighted it was. But if you read certain things, like I was reading children's books, I think Richard Scarry from the early 60s. Boy.
I don't know this one. No.
Oh, it's like Busy Town or Happy Town or whatever, where there's all those little animals going about their day. And then one of the pages, they're like, let's build a road to this factory. And then there's this kind of nice little wilderness, and they bulldoze it all down, and they build hot dog stands along the road. And it's just...
And they celebrate this?
Yeah. It's from today's perspective, that would appear as a parody of like this evil person who's like doing that. But that was just like, hey, the residents, we've now got our road, and we can have a hot dog on the way, and then the factory's just like belching out all of these fumes and things. And
it's like unimaginable in a children's book today.
Exactly. And it's just a generation ago, or maybe 2 now or something. But it's, this is, moral change can happen in a big way, possibly even going too far or something. People people really neglect this.
A lot of prominent people in the AI world think that AGI is coming very soon, like in coming years. I know that you think things could take significantly longer. Like, why could it take until 2040 or even longer than that to get to AGI?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons. So a lot of the bullish kind of projections at the moment are driven by the possibility of recursive self-improvement, and it's possible that doesn't pan out. That's one possibility. Another is the possibility that we decide not to do it, so that there is some kind of global moratorium or something else like that, where even if we could, we don't. And I think that in that case, I think that's just a very credible way that you get at least a 10% chance that it doesn't happen by 2040 to do with choices made not to do it, and some kind of treaty that then has some verification or something that's actually blocking it. But even if neither of those, well, I guess, let's suppose that there isn't such a moratorium. It could just be that it's a lot further off than we think. So in the world of AI, there's a lot of the progress is tracked through benchmarks. And you start off at just solving a few percent of the problems in the benchmark set. Let's say it's image recognition, and it started off with this MNIST, which was just identifying individual digits, handwritten digits, like 4. And then progress kind of went from getting a few percent of them right to getting almost 100% of them right. And then they started off with ImageNet, where it was like more complicated color photographs of little objects and things like a cup. And it had to kind of work that out. It kind of went from just getting a few percent of them right, and it kind of went up through 50% and then got to kind of saturation. And then, you have more challenging, image recognition tasks. And for each benchmark, you can often kind of predict, it looks like it's curving upwards now, and it looks like, maybe in a couple of years, we'll saturate out this benchmark and it'll be getting almost 100% right. But it's really unclear how many more benchmarks there'll be before you get to where you want to go. And I used to think, it's just like another benchmark away or something. I kind of felt like, well, there won't be that many. And now I think, well, I mean, could there be 10? Just how many times do you have to go through this process? It's very hard to actually know. So that's one aspect, is that people who think that we're very close to getting something, where does this knowledge come from that if we just kind of go through this process again, say with mathematics or something, and this AIME kind of, that benchmark was amazing for the AI community, because it took them from basically through the reasoning models era, like from late 2024, through to the end of 2025, they went from a couple of percent on this thing to saturating it. So they climbed this benchmark. But then at the end of that, there's still so much more to go. And so that's kind of one aspect. Another one is if you think about something like the meter time horizons, this question of how long a task in terms of how many hours it would take a human to do it, can the AI succeed half the time if it deals with it? And, we've seen this exponential progress in this number. And then people, often think, once it hits like a full workday, it can do 8 hours, kind of worth of human tasks, an 8-hour human task, then it'll be able to kind of just repeat that or something each day. But it doesn't quite work like that. And then they thought, maybe 40 hours. It's like it can do a whole work week or something. But it's just not clear why any particular number corresponds to reaching human level or something on this metric. And so it's something where we'll have this graph, and there'll be people who say, I believe in the god of straight lines on graphs or something, that if you see some kind of trend, that you should be betting that you can keep extrapolating the trend. Let's just grant all of that, and let's suppose that you can completely extrapolate this trend. Well, what's how high does it have to get, before we reach this kind of AGI level or transformative AI or superintelligence or something? Well, no one knows. So even if you grant the heroic assumption that you can extrapolate the trend as far as you want, you've got the straight line, but and eventually, if it hit this level, you could read off the time at which it gets there. But we don't know what level it would be, and so that leads to like this kind of big uncertainty. Even when we've got like the data, it's none of the data like comes with a thing that then you can just read off the year from that data. That if you say, I just want to follow the data and follow the projections and do as little kind of like second guessing as possible and just see where the data leads me, it just doesn't lead you to an actual year on like when this will happen. So that's one of the reasons to just have like really kind of uncertainty about it.
So I feel like that line of argument, it certainly gets me out to 2030. It probably gets me out to 2035. And then I'm like, 2040, 2045? I just sort of have a degree of disbelief about that things could take that long. I guess just given the level that the AIs are operating at now. And by 2040, like even on conservative predictions, would have 10,000 times as much compute, like maybe much, much more. Would have done so many more experiments. There'll be like many more people working in the industry. Mm-hmm. Do you share, like, is there any intuitive disbelief or like astonishment you have at the idea that it would take until then?
Not really. Okay. I mean, one aspect is that the rate at which, say, models were getting 10 times bigger or 10 times as many parameters or 10 times as much compute being needed to train them and so on. That rate, like how many years till the next 10x, that has started to slow down. And there's reason to think that there'll be a bit of a kink at the curve at 2030 or so when, a lot of the growth has just been not how fast can we scale up the compute being manufactured, but how fast can companies open their wallets, as in
and suck compute away from everyone else.
Yeah, and so the part of it is like how quickly can we convince venture capitalists to invest a whole lot of extra money, or convince kind of people we're borrowing from, or convince the CFO of our company to kind of make what would seemingly be outlandish investment decisions. And then part of it has been how quickly can TSMC convert like the share of their manufacturing that's GPUs. Instead of being, chips for iPhones and things like that, how quickly can they kind of increase that share towards 100%? But they can't just make 10 TSMCs, very quickly. The time needed to, have 10 copies of their entire manufacturing footprint or something is really quite large. And so you start to, a lot of this kind of early growth does taper off. So we'll be kind of ripping through the orders of magnitude in scaling more slowly over time. And we also run into this issue that even if you have more compute for pre-training, that the amount of human data is limited, and that we've already gone through all of the scientific papers that have ever been published and all of the books that have ever been written up until 2025. And then if you say, well, what about the books from 2026? Like, how's that much? Is that going to move the needle on the sum total of human knowledge or something? Maybe not very much. So data limitations and so on. So there's a bunch of reasons to think that conditional upon scaling not giving you some extremely powerful level of AI by 2030 or by 2035 or something, well, maybe that's a suggestion that actually you need something more than scaling at that point. And I think that there may well be like additional capabilities that are needed that may require actual research breakthroughs rather than just kind of tweaking the algorithms a little bit.
New host on the show, Tom Reed, he recently wrote a piece arguing that he suspects that it's not possible to have a recursive self-improvement loop that takes you to superintelligence just occurring in a data center, because you won't have enough training data to become highly skilled at many different kinds of tasks. Because in order to do that, you actually have to try doing the task. You have to be deployed in the real world, in factories and in offices, in order to get the training data and the feedback to become highly skilled at those things. And he thought this was going to be like a super important constraint. Do you buy it?
Yeah. So I read this piece and it really frustrated me at first. And then something clicked and then I kind of really liked it. So what I was frustrated by is that he was kind of, it felt to me like there was a conflation between intelligence and capability. So it's true that you can't, there might be a whole bunch of capabilities you can't gain without a whole lot of access to real world data and attempts to try them, and see and learn from the experience and so on, especially the things that don't have verifiable rewards, or at least they don't have verifiable rewards in an artificial environment. You need to go to the real world to find out. And I thought, you know what, I think you could get, at least I don't see why you couldn't become extremely intelligent, but you would still lack those skills. But that's just really a rephrasing or something of his point, or a slight rearrangement of it. But it gives a version of it that I think is really interesting, which is that maybe you could reach a kind of super intelligent system in a data center where it's kind of like training and learning a bunch of things. It gets really skilled at things like mathematics, and maybe by kind of self-improving, it gets really good at a whole lot of other things. Suppose you did. Suppose there was no obstacle to how smart it was. And so the thing that came out of this data center at the end of this, you could think of it like an amazingly bright student who's just finished they've just finished their undergrad degree. They're going to go out into the workforce, and the world is their oyster. They could go into politics. They could go into business, into tech, into finance, into journalism. Okay, and let's suppose they're so capable as the most capable kind of person applying for the job in any of these areas. Okay, but they would be kind of applying for an entry-level job. So the most capable person, with the most potential for journalism, who hasn't yet
ever written anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They haven't yet reported on a hot button issue and then got a whole lot of flack or whatever, and had to work out how to kind of navigate it, and they haven't worked out how to trade off the risk to the reputation of the newspaper they're writing for versus the kind of integrity to the facts and so on. And so I think what I would say is, even if you could train something with recursive self-improvement to become extraordinarily intelligent, there may just be a lot of skills and capabilities that it won't yet possess. And you wouldn't fault its intelligence for that. You wouldn't say, oh, you're less intelligent because you don't possess these skills. So suppose, for example, Tim Cook is stepping down from the CEO of Apple. And they've already got someone lined up. But suppose that they didn't, and they thought, oh, hey, this AI is super intelligent. We could have it be the next CEO of Apple. Well, I'm not sure about that. In the same way as if there's a really bright, student who's just finished college,
the most fast learning 21-year-old.
Yeah,
I guess. Yeah.
You'd still say, no, actually, there's a bunch of experience about the culture of Apple, for example, that you would need to know in order to do this job, and also a lot of relationships and trust that some people have built up, and it helps you realize that it's kind of connected to the diffusion question of how much of a lag is there from having these amazing AI capabilities demonstrated to them actually being out everywhere in the world, where it could be that to be a great CEO of a Fortune 500 company, that it does actually take a decade or more of just calendar time in terms of approaching kind of new opportunities, seeing the business cycle happen, seeing kind of people who are betting the wrong way get wiped out by the market. And it's not just cases where you can learn from what's happened in the past. There'll be a whole lot of new conditions that have never existed before, including with AI, totally changing everything. And so it made me realize that actually, even if, so instead of saying you can't become super intelligent in a data center, I'd say even if you become super intelligent in a data center, that doesn't necessarily make you super capable and able to do all of these jobs. And what it would probably leave you with is being a great entry-level employee in anything and advancing along the career trajectory faster than normal humans. So you're kind of better than a relatively fresh-faced, 21-year-old of any stripe or something. But not that you're better than people with 30 years of hard-won experience or context on those jobs. And so that could mean that that doesn't say much about how transformed will the world be in 50 years' time. But it does say that actually maybe if you had this amazingly intelligent AI in a particular year, maybe a couple of years later, the world isn't that transformed because it can't be doing most of the jobs yet. So that kind of, did make me think about an additional delay to add into this kind of calculation of, at which point do you get recursive self-improvement, if it's possible, and then how long does it take to reach a kind of, real highly intelligent system? Okay, but then there's another delay between how long does it take to have the highly intelligent system, let's say, and it getting into a whole lot of companies.
And having lots of concrete skills.
And then once it's in those companies, how long does it take from entering that company to understanding enough about these types of roles in order to be able to really deliver at a senior level kind of performance? So it kind of, it may add, I don't know, so somewhere between 6 months and 20 years, depending on the particular job, to some of those areas. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting point. I guess Tom sounded pretty confident that this was going to lead to big delays, and I think that might be right. But I guess I also think it might be wrong for a couple of different reasons. I guess you could have really big improvements in the speed of learning, basically by that point, or the sample efficiency is the kind of technical term for how many examples or how much experience do you need in order to gain to figure out how to do stuff. I guess human sample efficiency is actually unfathomable extraordinary in some ways. I guess I don't often get to pull the parent card having a toddler. Mm-hmm. It is unbelievable that they can see an example of a pig, and then they will be able to tell all of these other things that look very different are also pigs. And this stylized picture of a pig is also a pig. I don't actually understand how on earth it's going on. And I guess AI researchers don't know either.
It is incredible. And I went through the same thing with my child.
The out-of-sample generalization is... Yeah.
And, these drawings will be, is in the standard way that we depict things. We don't teach the children how we depict things, but there's line drawings. And things look nothing like line drawings. The line drawing is this extremely stylized thing where, where the edge of a mug or something, will be, that's the only bit that you draw, and you don't draw anything in between. But there are actually no lines there if you look at the world. And yet they'll see, a drawing of a teapot, and then they'll be able to recognize one in the real world
immediately. Yeah,
immediately. It is very remarkable, and I think that the upper bound on what is possible to learn with Bayesian systems and various other things is even better than the humans on this. But the deep learning, it is really an Achilles heel, and before it showed that it was just so successful once you pay the costs of doing all this extra training. A lot of people were dismissive of it because of this lack of sample efficiency, and that hasn't gotten much better.
Yeah, so that's a point against what I was saying. So they have awful sample efficiency, but you could get a million-fold improvement. We know it could be a million-fold better because humans are a million-fold better, and we're presumably not the very best that's possible. So that's one way that this sort of thing could not pan out, is if through recursive self-improvement or some other way, you have a different architecture for learning.
And it could be that they can learn from each other, right? So it could be that there's a lot of complicated things about being a partner in a law firm or something like that. But each year, there's 10,000 deployed models, that are learning and pooling their information. So you could have a situation like that where that's also enabling it to learn faster, although it still won't, if the markets are correlated and so on, there will still be, that will be helpful.
Only have experience of that year.
Yeah, that will be helpful for rare things, like a particular type of client who comes in and is really obnoxious or something, and how you deal with that rare case. It will be helpful for that, pooling it across many different firms. But it won't be helpful for the kind of rare, once in a decade or once in 30 years kind of events that happen and upset the whole thing. So it is... it's by no means certain, but it is. It's quite possible that there would be this substantial delays, at least for them doing these non-entry level tasks.
Well, yes. So that's one way, is that the AIs could learn very quickly because many instances of them are deployed and they all collect data and they pull it together. Another one is we're already beginning to kind of put video cameras basically on people's heads and record all their keystrokes. So it's possible by this time we'll have actually a huge new data set of basically what lawyers do and how they think and what they look at and so on that they could learn from.
That could well be right. It is interesting that Meta were a trailblazer on this one and have just recently gone back on it. The employees absolutely hated it.
Oh, really? Okay,
it was also clear that they were just literally automating. It was a humiliating way of being automated out of your job with these cameras just watching it. It's the level of demeaningness, to the person and so on, is a real kick in the teeth for these people, and they're already pretty demoralized over there with falling behind on AI and so on. And so They hated it, and then there was lo and behold, there was a big leak of information because it was logging every single thing that they did. I don't know the details of it, but then when that happened, they were just like absolute revolt on this issue, and we're getting rid of it. So, and if we're in a world where there's like increasing kind of protests on the street about like unemployment and so on, kind of being driven by this, and then the answer is we're
sticking cameras on all of your heads.
All the remaining lawyers who haven't yet been automated in the firm and now have their cameras on them and so on because like they're the owner of the company.
Planning to replace them next year.
They're people may not wear it, is what I'm saying. It's possible. I don't know which way that would go because there could be like large financial incentives for the few firms who do it. It could be possible. Maybe you pay them larger than their entire salary in order to wear this camera because the amount you'll make.
It's like a redundancy payment.
Yeah. But if the public sentiment is just, put sand in the machines, you could
imagine it being banned.
It could be banned. It's a good point. And it might be that companies that try to do it are just shamed. So I don't know. But by the same token, I think there'll be some of it. So
it's another. It might or it might not.
Yeah, it's hard to predict.
Just to finish out my various objections, I think the last one was some things I imagine you can learn through simulation. And I guess they already kind of do this. I guess that's sort of AR or VR is a sort of simulation. I don't know. But you can imagine if you have a really good internal world model, then you might not have to go and actually like do these things in the real world because you can just imagine it. I guess it's like, I think humans learn partly through dreaming. And I imagine there's some of this is like we imagine situations and react to them. And that helps us to like process the information that we have. And I guess perhaps AIs could do that as well.
That's right. Although there's also another interesting case where when people are trying to estimate how much they're being sped up by AI, they tend to think of their hours in the office, right? Like so the on-the-clock hours. But like if you get an AI to do some task for you and you save 4 hours and it does it instead, you don't learn from having done the task. So you're not necessarily in as good a position as you would have been if you'd done it. And then also, there's a bunch of thinking, certainly in academia, that people kind of classify as like shower thoughts or something, where you're still only having one shower a day. Even at Anthropic, where they're being sped up by 4x, and there's just certain kinds of like processing of what's going on, and perhaps more realistic than showers, although that's perhaps where some of the thoughts kind of come out because you can't be reading a book or doing
it's the one time you don't have a screen in front of you.
Or similarly, like going on a walk or something, or another kind of famous example. But sleeping, you still only sleep for 8 hours. They're not getting like 3 nights worth of processing of everything that you've been tracking and having it kind of click into place in your mind or something. But a lot of like, if you kind of read biographies of like scientists who've had major breakthroughs, it seems to be some of these aspects of they finally had a change in scene. They kind of went on holiday or something, or that they woke up and the thing was just clear to them that maybe it had been processed. We know that the brain does an awful lot of stuff during these dreaming processes and so on, and presumably it's not nonsense, and it is actually part of like what makes this work. And
if you deny people dreaming, I think they like. Their ability to remember what happened the previous day is catastrophically ruined. Okay. Yeah, so it's like a huge factor in learning, I think.
Yeah, and so, it's worth noting that we're not speeding those things up. And so it might be that, that some of the numbers that we're getting are just really not the relevant ones.
I've got this piece that we published recently where I try to like make sense of all of the different updates that we've gotten about timelines to AGI through 2026. And I guess one of the ones I had on the list was that OpenAI, one of their models, I think they haven't named which one, it made some progress on like disproving a commonly believed conjecture about the unit, the unit distance problem, which I guess is like a possible sign that it's learning, it's becoming a creative researcher, it's able to have original thoughts. But I ended up concluding that I'm really unsure whether to be impressed by this or not. It's like, it's cool, but it's very hard to interpret. Do you have a take on like whether this is impressive or not?
Yeah, I think it's impressive. And I think that the mathematical community were clearly impressed. And so, I mean, that said, it may have already been baked into your, assumptions. A lot of people are assuming radically impressive progress every year. So seeing something that is really impressive may just be only enough to keep it on trend. But this unit distance conjecture is, I think, a genuinely natural and interesting question. Ultimately, the idea is if you have like a 2D plane and you kind of can put some points on it, if you could put like n points anywhere on this plane, how can you arrange them to make as many as possible exactly one, like let's say 1 centimeter away from each other? So putting them in a circle, that's evenly spaced would be a way to do it. And that would let you get for n points, you could get n unit distances. But it turns out you can get a little bit more if you put them in a square grid. And then the AI kind of it had been conjectured by Erdős, who's like a very famous mathematician, that the square grid was basically as good as you could do. But then it showed that you could do something a little bit better. And so it didn't prove a theorem, but it disproved his famous conjecture that a lot of people thought was true. And this is unlike a lot of other kind of results that AI systems had produced before this. This was one that genuinely a bunch of mathematicians had spent some time trying to solve. It wasn't just something that wasn't solved because almost no one had spent any time on it. So I think pretty cool theorem, or not a theorem, a pretty cool disproof of a conjecture. Unfortunately, the conjecture was quite elegant, and instead now we're in this world where it's it's more complex than that in some kind of slightly ugly way. So that, but it did it, if you look kind of under the hood, by combining this area of combinatorial geometry with another area of mathematics that previously thought to be unconnected. So in some level, it's a bit of a shallow result because it's if you happen to know about both those things, if you found out that the person who had done it was a human and they'd just been brought up in this other area where they became intimately familiar with this kind of weird mathematical structure, instead of a square grid, this other kind of structure that you use. And then they were told about the unit distance conjecture and they thought, why don't I use the thing I did in my PhD thesis? And you'd be like, I guess lucky that you did that, lucky you had that combination. So what was exciting about it for mathematicians was that there wasn't previously known a connection between these two areas. And so it found a kind of connection which will let mathematicians kind of import a whole lot of ideas from one area into the other area. So they're normally excited about results like that when humans do them. And so they're also excited here. So I think pretty cool stuff. But there's a bit of a feeling in the maths community that's, and people vary on this, but there's a bit of a strand of feeling that, there might not be any jobs for mathematicians, or this really could be coming for us. And maybe it is, but I think it's illuminating to think about the limits on this thing. So suppose, this isn't even a theorem, it just disproved a particular thing. And one of the reasons it hadn't been disproved before is everyone thought it was true, so not many people had tried to disprove it. But let's suppose that we kind of kept going in this direction and much further. And we had a system, maybe in a year or two or something. Let's suppose we have a system that can, if you give a formal statement of mathematics, you make some mathematical claim, that it could prove or disprove it in a microsecond. Okay, so we're not going to get that. But and in fact, Gödel's incompleteness theorem says you can't actually quite get that. But let's suppose you got it. Okay, somehow, impossibly. Would maths be over if you can just take any claim and check whether it's a theorem instantly? It turns out it's very much not over, and I think mathematicians are underselling the other aspects of mathematics.
Yeah, what are those?
Yeah, so one of them is why were we interested in the unit distance conjecture? It's a pretty simple kind of claim, but if you suppose you could prove one of these things per microsecond, if you started doing that now, the stars would have, I did some calculations on this, the stars would have burnt out by the time you even came up to the unit distance conjecture to even try to prove it. So there's just too many mathematical statements. There's all kinds of statements 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, and so on. There's infinitely many true mathematical statements. So you have to kind of greatly prune this space of statements to the interesting statements. And that is one way to rephrase that is what questions should we be asking? What are the interesting mathematical questions? And it's not clear that it can do that it can work out which questions to ask. So at that point, you'd still need humans to say, this one is one of the ones I want to actually have the system spend its time on, not this exponentially growing thicket of uninteresting questions. So that's the first step. And then beyond that, there's even richer. There's this kind of question of what are the AI systems, can take some formal statement in some kind of theory of mathematics, in this case, discrete geometry and then try to prove it. But they can't create new theories of mathematics. So if you go back in time, say before Claude Shannon invented information theory, like now, like today, we could ask questions about, the information that can be carried over a noisy channel and optimal coding and stuff like that. But we didn't even know how to ask those questions back then. So we didn't know like what kind of formal statements to have that would correspond to these kind of like informal and inchoate ideas that we hadn't kind of fully kind of pinned down. And so when people, mathematicians invent areas like that, there's a kind of, extreme creativity. So if you go back like to the 19th century, there'd been thousands of years of geometry. And then in the 19th century, mathematicians worked out how to, you could ask questions about things beyond 3 dimensions, like 4-dimensional cube. How many corners would a 4-dimensional cube have? But they didn't ask these questions prior to then. And then they also kind of worked out in the 19th century, you could have curved spaces. And they didn't realize that we actually live in one. But they just thought it was an interesting mathematical kind of question. And they also kind of worked out about fractional dimensions, like things between 2 and 3 dimensions. And like there was this kind of burst of creativity that you could ask all of these types of things. Or if you think about the origin of calculus, that we could ask about like, not just like, how high up is some curve, but we could ask about the slope of the curve and how that changes over time and so on. And that once they came up with these theories, all of a sudden there was this kind of whole infinite range of new interesting questions you could ask. And the AI systems haven't shown that they can do that at all. So I think there's like, I think it's instructive to see that even if mathematicians spend a lot of time proving things, there's these other layers that haven't really begun to be automated.
So they can't do it now, but I would expect that stuff is coming soon. Do you agree?
It might be. Yeah. So I'm not claiming that it won't be able to do it. Just that there's this kind of thing that we kind of think, we can see this trend. We're laser focused on this issue about proving things or something, and then we think that a mathematician, that's what they do, and that it's going to automate that away. But it's easy to lose track of the fact that there are these higher level kind of questions, which I've always thought are the more important questions in mathematics. I'm less impressed if someone proves a difficult theorem than if they invent a new kind of branch of mathematics where entirely new questions come into view and new concepts. That's always been what I thought was the more impressive thing. And if we look at like the history of automation of mathematics, for most of the time until like the 20th century, actually, mathematicians spent something like half their time doing numerical calculations. And then the calculator automated all of that away. So it automated, half of a mathematician's job. And we don't think that was a great shame or something. And we also didn't think we were on the verge of a singularity or something when we did that. And then from about 1980 to now, symbolic manipulation, so like solving algebraic equations and integrals and things like that, has also got basically entirely automated before the AI era. And again, that was what then mathematicians spent a lot of time doing. And now they don't have to do it at all. And they don't even really talk about that very much. But I think that, again, they were by and large freed from a relatively pedestrian part of their job. And that, maybe if proving things gets automated, they'll also be freed to be kind of like asking the questions and to kind of inventing these new theories. And these are areas where creativity is needed. And I think that those lessons aren't just relevant for the mathematicians listening to this, but are potentially relevant, in a whole lot of jobs. Where they're like famously in the case of radiology, that the reading the scans bit, we tend to, from a distance, think that's what a radiologist does. But it turns out that less than half the time of a radiologist is spent interpreting scans. And it's like, because, and so and I think there's similar things with a lot of jobs where we look at some component of it and see this kind of curve of being automated away, but we forget that there are kind of like richer and higher level things where it's not that the humans are necessarily being kind of pushed into the gaps of like, for example, some mathematicians talk about maybe humans will be still needed to explain to other humans what the new AI mathematicians have achieved. I feel like that is a case of being pushed. I think actually science communication is really good. But
you wouldn't feel central to the story, I guess.
They would feel less happy about that. Whereas if they're instead inventing entire new branches of mathematics, and then the AIs are helping them explore them, I think they would actually feel pretty good about that. So we don't know how long it will take before it can do those things. And it could be that it's just another year after or something like that. But I'm more pointing out that we don't know, and that it's a bit like with these benchmarks. We're seeing proving start to get kind of off the ground, where it's starting to be able to prove like non-trivial theorems. Maybe that will kind of saturate and it'll be able to prove all kinds of like challenging theorems that would take humans years to do. And yet we'd find out there's another benchmark above it, which is asking the right questions, and then that starts to saturate. And there's another one, which is inventing new fields. And I think we've seen that a lot in the history of AI, that we start off thinking something like chess is AI complete was this kind of term, which means it's as hard as anything, such that if it can do that, it'll be able to do everything, because it's kind of like the last rung to fall or something. So then people go and work on it, and then they find out, oh no, actually they still can't understand English at the time when they can master chess. And then kind of, we get to the case of Go or something, and it turns out they still couldn't speak English fluently at that point. And then we think maybe speaking English is the thing. And then it's like, oh no, we've got systems that can kind of quite fluently like deploy language, but they're unable to do some other things. And so we genuinely don't know how far that process goes. And there are very few attempts to systematically kind of like say, here's the set of things and here's, how there isn't much left. And certainly I've found, as someone who's generally been compared to the average, actually pretty bullish about AI timelines, that I've noticed myself falling
how
for
many
this.
times there are more things yet to go.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you wrote this piece not too long ago arguing that we shouldn't think of ourselves as having short timelines or long timelines or medium timelines, but rather having broad timelines. We should kind of embrace the reality that we don't know when AGI is going to come. Make the case for that. I guess you've already somewhat made the case for that. Is much to add?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things. So one of them is that there's a lot of expert disagreement on this, like lasting expert disagreement. The experts aren't just intractable. If you look overall, Helen Toner has this great piece showing that actually their timelines have shortened over the last 5 years, like since
significantly.
Yeah, quite significantly. By I think about a factor of 10 or something. At least from some forecasting platforms, gone from 50 years to 5 years. So really, so it can change, but there's still a very large amount of disagreement between different people. And those people come often from different fields, incorporating a lot of different forms of expertise. So obviously people who are AI specialists have very clear and relevant expertise in this. But also people who are, say, psychologists have a lot of relevant expertise. Economists have a lot of relevant expertise. If the question is, will this be able to replace humans like in labor, and kind of their role in the economy or something? They've seen a lot of waves of automation and are kind of experts perhaps at automation. So there's a lot of different forms of expertise being brought to bear. The individuals who form their opinion they're not aware of a lot of the hard-won insights that other people are bringing to the table. And so they're not in a position to actually say, I do not need to listen to your view on this. And that if they give, at least there's this question of like, what's the chance the other person knows more than you, right? So half the time, like if you take two experts, the other one had a better idea of the picture, than you did, or better or equal. But we're assuming they disagree. And yet you kind of, in order to have like a kind of narrow range of timelines, you really have to be excluding a lot of people and saying, nope, you're wrong. And I'm not interested really in hedging a bit by kind of like moving towards what you're saying. So that's one kind of point. Lasting expert disagreement.
And what actually, can I remember? What's the other key point?
Yeah, the other thing is that if you look at forecasters on this, and the best forecasters, I think, they don't just give a point estimate for when it's going to happen, but they explain their own uncertainty. And so the ideal way to do this is by having a probability density function, one of these like a bell curve or something, although it doesn't have to be symmetrical, that shows like, exactly how much probability in which year. And the kind of the lay version of this is like confidence interval, to say somewhere between this year and this other year. But the probability distribution is even nicer if you can get it. And so a lot of people have actually sketched these out. For example, the AI Futures Project, who gave us the AI 2027 scenario, they've got some very nice and interesting modeling of recursive self-improvement driven AI progress. And they've the two leads on that, Daniel Cocotaglio and Eli Lifland, have have got their own probability distributions you can look at, and Coccatello is generally thought of as
about as bullish as you can get.
Yeah, exactly, a real short timelines person. But if you look at his distribution, and he's recently changed it to actually be a bit more bullish in the last few months. But his distribution, he thinks that there's a 10% chance it will happen within 9 months. So that's pretty bullish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then he thinks his median estimate, so the 50-50 point, his over or under kind of number, is, I think it's 4 years at the moment. And then he thinks that there's a 90% chance it will happen within 14 years, which is taking us up to 2040. But he would say there's a 10% chance it goes beyond 2040. And so I like to think about these estimates in terms of what I call the 80% confidence interval. So we're often familiar with a 95% confidence interval in science, where there's ranging from from the 2.5th centile up to the 97.5. Here I'm just thinking actually from the 10% to the 90%. So the kind of confidence interval where you think there's a 10% chance it's earlier than anything inside this window, and there's a 10% chance it's later than anything. So there's only a 80% chance that it actually happens in the window that you specify. So we're not asking for giant amounts of confidence, right? It's very, very possible that it will fall outside this. So Daniel's one is from 9 months to 14 years. That's pretty wide. And that is an example of, it's maybe at the narrower end of what I'd call broad timelines, but I think that counts as an example. So ultimately, that's about a factor of 20. So he's kind of saying there's a factor of 20 uncertainty in when this thing will happen between 9 months and 14 years. And he's saying that, and there's a 20% chance it doesn't even lie in that giant window that he's created. So that's pretty broad already. And if you look at other people's, they're also really broad. So there was a summary of that Epoch did of I think 10 different forecasts methods, and all of their 80% confidence intervals were more than 50 years long. And I think almost all of them had more than a factor of 10 between the early number and the late number. And then also, if you look at this big Grace et al. Paper where they surveyed a whole lot of experts from people who were presenting at the major machine learning conferences that year, and they surveyed more than 2,000 people. They had this another kind of vast range, where the 10% number, I think in that case was just 4 years. And the 90% number was beyond the span that was being looked at, so more than 100 years. And so again, there's at least a 25 times multiplier. My own kind of 80% interval is something I can't remember. I did work this out recently. It's something like 2 years to more than 100 years. I think it was 3 to 100 was my estimate. So 30 times multiplier. And so this is people are trying to say with these attempts to actually express their uncertainty that there's this wild levels of uncertainty in these things.
Yeah, in the piece you lean reasonably heavily on the fact that I guess it seems even the most bullish timelines people do have reasonably wide confidence intervals. I'm a little bit nervous about over relying on that because I guess in the case of the AI futures people, I think they've spent a lot more time modeling the rapid timelines than they've modeled the longer timelines. So I worry that under the hood, what you would find is that they've just said, and there's a chance that it takes a lot longer, and we don't know. It might not be as considered as the rapid recursive self-improvement scenarios that they write about. And another reason is I'm not sure when people say, well, it could take much longer than 2040 or 2050. I'm not sure whether they're saying it won't be technically feasible until then because it just requires an insane amount of compute or we don't have the data. Or they're saying there could be a war between the US and China that destroys civilization. Maybe that's why it takes 100 years. And it's very different implications, I think, between these two.
Yeah, so I don't think they're saying much about the latter. And in general, I worry that a lot of people who are forecasting this are largely saying, when will we, in business as usual or something, when would we have the capacity to create these advanced AI systems if we wanted to? Or something, such that if their moratorium happens and then we reach 2040 and it hasn't happened, as in we haven't reached this level of transformative AI. I worry that a lot of people would say, yeah, well, I'm not wrong, but because this thing got in the way, and we could have done it. And that's not the forecast I think that they should be making, or at least if they are, they need to be super clear about it. Because I think the forecast that matters for most people is when will we have these systems, not when would we, if we'd behaved optimally in a certain sense and ignored how dangerous it was, when would we have them? But rather something more like when will we have them? Well, it does depend on the use.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm focused on the technical feasibility question a bit more because I'm thinking, well, this creates a deadline by which we have to have figured out a bunch of stuff, like deciding whether we're like being able to coordinate to decide whether we're going to go ahead with it or not, or figuring out some way to do it safely.
Well, it depends on the question. So suppose the question is alignment, and what you're thinking is that should I kind of invest in this, just kind of like tweaking the current alignment paradigm or working within this paradigm, or should I invest in like creating kind of new ideas, like exploring and kind of finding kind of fundamentally different ways of doing alignment that could have better guarantees, like Yoshua Bengio is doing with his project. If you're thinking about that, it is relevant if there just isn't going to be, like, suppose that there isn't AI, or this kind of transformative level of AI by 2035 because we decided not to do it. Well, that does mean that you have more time to actually,
figure things out and become relevant.
Yeah. And so if instead you said, but because we could have done it, I'm going to then ignore the possibility of these higher kind of guarantee type methods, this kind of exploring the space of ideas and just focus on tweaking the current things, I think that would mislead you. So I think that for many purposes, actually what you want to care about is when will these systems exist rather than when could we have had them exist. Yeah. But there's also a bit of a thing that annoys me, but where they'll never know that they're wrong if they do that version, because they're saying, well, we could have if we hadn't had that pause, or like, if the companies had just kind of lent more into recursive self-improvement and they hadn't chickened out on it, then we would have had it or something. We'll never know if that's right or not. And a lot of the idea of the forecasting community prides itself on is actually falsifiability by some date. And all of the versions that say if a whole bunch of things that are not even fully well specified happen, if we're in one of the normal cases, it will happen by this point. And then they'll say, I guess we weren't in one of the normal cases. So my forecast is moot. Yeah.
I guess on the falsifiability point, I guess there's been a lot of slippage. There's been a lot of vagueness about exactly what people are describing, and I think this is as true of me as anyone. I think I used to talk a lot about timelines to AGI. These days, I often think and talk more about timelines to recursive self-improvement. I think other people, and including me in the past, we've also talked about like timelines to artificial superintelligence, and there's other points along that as well. And I suppose, because we're all throwing out dates and like sometimes not specifying exactly what we're talking about, it's easy to like agree but feel like you're disagreeing.
This is a big issue, and also it can explain differences between in one person's forecasts between different times. The AI Futures Project are great on this issue because they have, I think, 4 different kind of versions of the question that they're asking, and they provide forecasts for all of them. And then you can see how they're moving over time and so on. I love it. Even if I think that they're maybe a bit bullish, but. You mentioned a few there. I also think AGI is not quite the right one to be forecasting now, that we're sufficiently close to it that I don't think it's good to say the current models are AGI. But if someone disagreed, I can't prove they're obviously wrong. And it's not unreasonable to say that actually we've hit the threshold of AGI, even though it can't, for example, run a vending machine or can't run a cafe profitably or something. I feel like that probably shouldn't count. But
I think 10 years ago we would have said that AGI would be able to run a cafe.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know that one's goalpost shifting. They might say, it can prove novel mathematical results at the expert level, so you are shifting the goalpost. But I'm like, well, yeah, but we thought that by the time it could do that, it would be able to kind of like run some kind of cafe or something. So
thought these things would come together, and it turns out they don't.
Yeah. So we partly discovered like more and more jaggedness and so on, of these systems that we'd thought were quite general. Part of the reason for that is that is actually a big point, is that this process of going to the reasoning models, what that did was the verifiable tasks, such as mathematics or programming, they got a huge boost because you could run this reinforcement learning loop where what you do is you get it to try the thing again and again and again, and you check if it got it right. And if it did, then you kind of increase the likelihood of producing answers like that. But for tasks such as almost everything that are not verifiable rewards, say every other subject in the university or something like that, it's or running a cafe or something. It's just much harder. In the case of the cafe, you do eventually get verifiable rewards in the real world, but only if you look at how many runs you have to do. You have to run 100,000 unprofitable cafes before you've actually gone through that process and spend a huge amount of money. So there's these two different classes of the skills or something. Like broadly speaking, there's the verifiable rewards ones and the others. And the others, there's not that much of a theory of the case as to how they're actually going to reach superhuman levels. Whereas the verifiable reward ones, we can see how that would work.
So is the main implication of broad timelines that people shouldn't only make bets that pay off in really quickly? Basically, I guess it sounds like from your piece, your main worry is that there might be people out there who are thinking, I really want to work on making AGI go better, but this project that I'm contemplating won't pay off for 5 years. That's just too long. There's no point even doing it. We'll be dead by then, or things will be out of our hands by then. I'm going to do this thing that pays off really quickly, and that thing otherwise could just be less impactful.
Yeah, that's a part of it.
Yeah.
What particularly frustrated me from some people in the short timelines camp was this idea that they'd make these declarations that everybody should only be doing work that could have demonstrable kind of impacts on making the intelligence explosion go better or something within a year, within 12 months, or some kind of claim like that. And that frustrated me because I don't think it was meant to apply to everyone. I think that they just weren't thinking about the full space. Suppose there's someone who's like currently, working at, in some other profession, but they're thinking of a career change to say switch to working on AI policy. But it's going to take them, a year to skill up in that before they can really get started. I think that they may well want to make that career change. Whereas if you have one of these kind of hard and fast rules, it could be that if you're already working on AI safety, that you should be kind of primarily focused on things that can kind of have concrete implications soon. But you want to be careful how many other people's careers you're somehow like weighing in on when you really haven't thought about like the full space of people's career choices. So if you look at, in my life, I've done things like founding Given What We Can, where I kind of worked out that over my life, I'd be able to donate a lot of money, and it would be able to, save many people's lives or create other kind of big benefits for people in poor countries. But by founding an organization where 10,000 people have joined, this is something where, there's this huge multiplier that can happen. And that was over about 17 years. We may not have 17 years, but even over, if you look at, where it was from when I first thought about this to where it was 5 years later, all of a sudden there were like dozens of people kind of working together, on these projects and having this kind of big multiplier. I think this is often the case. And a lot of successful things, like say AI governance was just kind of like a dream 10 years ago. When I first met Alan Defoe and he was talking about it, and I was like, what do you mean by AI governance? Like I distinctly remember having to ask him, like I didn't understand what he was talking about. And now it's like this,
quite a significant discipline.
Exactly, that exists at like many different universities, and the people who were just kind of getting started in it are now like, kind of in very high demand from governments like across the world for advice on these questions. So it's possible to get these really huge multipliers over periods of, say, 5 to 10 years, such that if you say, like, what's the chance that everything's moot, that AI has arrived, it's had transformative impacts on the world of the kind where you'd want to have all of your impact before this happens. Like, what's the chance that that's happened, let's say, within the next 5 years? I think the chance is something like 20% over the next 5 years. And this is a pretty high bar for transformative AI, not just that there is something that could do what a human could do, but the world hasn't yet changed. If so, that's like a 20% haircut on the expected value of like things that you could be doing, projects that really start to kind of kick into gear after 5 years, because there's a 20% chance that that's kind of moot. But the 20% haircut may just not be that significant if the other plan was going to have 10 times as like a 10 times multiplier on like what could be achieved, because you've kind of grown the set of people who are interested in some topic to some kind of much larger size. And so it's just not that uncommon to have like, say, a longer timeline or, project that you're considering or career, which would have 10 times the impact of the opportunities you have in the short run. Such that it survives the kind of haircut from the fact that it could be preempted. And so, yeah, kind of what I'm, especially with career change things. And so partly what I'm saying is that people should be very careful before they issue blanket advice to all people based on the possibility that things could happen soon. And so that's what had frustrated me from the short timelines camp.
So I guess I haven't heard anyone say anything as extreme as you shouldn't do anything that doesn't pay off for more than a year. But I could imagine that part of the motivation is just an absolute, like people are kicking and screaming because they're just so exasperated that they feel like the rest of society and like even governments that are like quite AGI pilled, there's like no hustle. There's like no sense of urgency to like address this stuff that they feel is like coming so soon. Yeah, I guess it's just difficult to balance these different audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that feeling. And in fact, I think that's kind of how I translate some of the statements that people are making, where they say no one should do this thing. Maybe they're not imagining that everyone will start to obey that dictate. They're instead thinking, well, too many people are doing things that take too long to pay off. And if I just like tweak that slightly, that's probably a good thing. Yeah, that might be true. And I like one way I kind of break this down is that I think that if you ignored questions about AI timelines and you looked at like whether the kind of best career path or the best kind of project to work on should pay off in the 2030s or pay off before that maybe something like half of the plans that would pay off in the 2030s, once you adjust for this, you should actually switch to the kind of like shorter plan. So I do think that there's a substantial effect or something, but it's by no means is it saying absolutely all of that is off the table. And no one should write any books. No one should start any movements. No one should, because all of those things take like longer to pay off. I feel like that would be a mistake. But the mistakes that the other people are making in the other direction are much bigger.
Yeah. Well, bigger than that? Bigger than only focusing on 1 year?
Maybe the issue is that people aren't actually following that particular command. But I think that in government, they're generally paying substantially too little attention to the possibility that this stuff could happen very soon, and in many other places, in pretty much everyone their distribution doesn't include enough of the short timelines bit. And so while I'm often focused on like my colleagues and friends and people who I think have gone a little bit too overboard on like overconfidence on short timelines, as opposed to just saying, you know what, it could well be short, we need to hedge against it, going a bit too far on it. But I think that the bigger mistake that's been made is in the other direction.
I think something that's even crazier is that there'll be governments or people in government who basically do have like shorter timelines or broad timelines or whatever, but then it feels like it has no effect almost on what's going on. I guess it's very hard to move institutions and to get them to do anything very, very quickly, to focus on like more, the future could be radically different. Because I guess they have a really strong immune reaction to that idea, because you don't want them to turn on a dime. I guess, yeah, what advice do you give to people in government about how they should like approach this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of like big mistakes that they could make. And I want to be kind of pretty clear on this. So by saying the broad timelines, I think another way to say it is like, the best single summary of like when will AI happen is not giving a number like a year, but is we don't know or something like that. Like so, and to embrace and acknowledge the big uncertainty of this issue compared to many other issues in sciences where they're kind of they know to within a year when it's going to happen for some particular event. So for us to say, it's not unreasonable to say we don't know. We don't know if it'll happen next year. We don't know if it'll happen 4 presidential terms from now. Like that's our level of uncertainty. So I think it's good that we acknowledge it and so on. But if I were like, or if you had a minister for AI, who's hearing this, one thing they might think is, oh, you're saying you don't know. And that gives me permission to just assume whatever I want to assume, as long as it was in the range of things you found credible. I think that that's often how politicians act and many people if you've got some view on some issue, like is it dangerous to eat this food that you enjoy eating? And then you find out that there's a kind of disagreement among the experts and that some of them think it's credible that it's safe to eat it and so on. You might be like, oh, okay, so I can just carry on doing what I was doing. I think that's a big mistake. Instead, it's not giving permission to do whatever it is that you want. Instead, it's more like you're obligated to actually pay attention to all of the different timeframes that experts find credible. So like an example would be, suppose that there's a volcano near the town, that you have, like, you're in Italy, or something. And the experts kind of disagree on whether they think actually there's a serious risk of like the volcano erupting. Some of them say it could be within a year, and some of them say actually 10 years or more. What do you do? Well, you don't say, well, because some of them said it could be 10 years, so I'm just going to go with that. Instead, you need to kind of be planning for both these contingencies. So maybe you need to be saying, okay, if it's within 1 year, that's too long. So it's too short a time in order to actually build defenses, like to divert the lava flow. So what we need is like an evacuation plan for like, if we see signs of an eruption, how do we get all of our citizens out of town? Okay. But then also, you don't want to say, okay, that's the only thing we're going to do. And then if it takes longer, we'll just waste the time we could have been building these kind of like earthworks, to defend the town.
Or to redivert the lava or whatever.
Yeah, there's no particular single number as to when it would happen that you should kind of like act as if it's going to happen at that year. Instead, you should be, taking seriously the possibilities that the experts are kind of pointing out. And one way I talk about this is that we don't know if we're in this race against timelines. We've only got so long before we have to, sort a lot of things out. But we don't know if that race is a sprint or a marathon. And that makes it really challenging to work out.
That's unfortunate.
It's unfortunate, but we should acknowledge that unfortunate fact. And if we say, but it could be a sprint, so we should all start sprinting now, well, that may not be the best thing to do. And I think overall, what you find is that in general, we should be hedging towards this possibility that it could come soon at a time when we're least prepared. I think that overall there is a push in that direction. And it's great that a lot of people have been, taking that seriously. But we don't want to go beyond hedging about that possibility and instead take a full-on unhedged bet that it's going to come soon. And neglect these other kind of possibilities where we could have been building communities, movements. We could have been taking actions like, for example, to get an international treaty against superintelligence that's not going to pay off in the first year or something. It's going to take a while before you could build up that awareness. Maybe it will take a while before AI capabilities are so strong that people feel in their bones that this is a real threat. But it could be that it's one of the best things that we could do about AI and saving humanity from this threat. So we want to, have this range of this portfolio of different approaches.
So in my timelines piece recently, I guess I spent quite a bit of time trying to, I guess there's so much short timeline stuff in the water at the moment, and I guess especially among the kind of people who I imagine might listen to 40 minutes about this topic, that I wanted to do a bunch of deflating, I guess, the hyped, or I don't know, getting people to think, well, it could take longer. But the flip side, I think, of almost everything that I say is that it also could be like quite short. There's actually quite a number of different pathways to which we could get extraordinary capability jumps relatively soon. I mean, a couple of them are, it could turn out that recursive self-improvement works where even with AIs that don't have a super broad range of skills. Maybe you only need to like train them on, I guess, coding, of course, but also like you get them to have like some decent research intuition about just AI in particular, and then they start having great ideas and insights that you can train on, or they're just very good at like setting up experiments, and basically it's all just like brute force search through different experiments, and that kind of pans out. You could also, it's possible, like there's this general phenomenon that the AIs are much better at well-specified, simple, structured tasks than they are at messy ones. And it's possible that they'll remain bad at the messy tasks for quite a long time to come because it's harder to train. But it's also possible that by making them superhuman at the well-structured, simple tasks, you'll get cross-generalization into the messy tasks, and then they'll become roughly human level at that, and then they're kind of, even their worst areas are human level, and then you can go a long way from that. So that's another possible path. It's possible that just through brute, I guess, there's a bunch of areas where the AIs are weak, like structure, long-term planning, things that are hard to do, reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards. But it's possible that just through like sheer force of effort, we could, or the AI companies could hire lots of people to basically read the outputs, read the work that the AIs do, to like grade where they've been doing well and where they've been doing poorly, and basically say whether they did a good job or not. That would be expensive, but the companies are spending a lot of money. I guess I've seen some people run numbers that maybe this would only kind of double the cost of a training run on this kind of thing. And so that way you could just produce like just enough data to basically get them to be human level at these kinds of strategic planning tasks or long time horizon tasks that so far we've been struggling to crack. There's probably a couple of others that I'm forgetting, but I guess I'm very worried about short timelines, like other people are, because there are a number of different like pathways to get there.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you said. Okay. I'm also very worried about short timelines. Thinking that it may well be long timelines doesn't make it all that much less worrying that it also may be short timelines.
Very quick, yeah.
And so I think that you're right, that there's a bunch of ways that it could come soon, especially if recursive self-improvement happens, and if it's at the easy end of the spectrum. So we don't know whether the field of AI, like in order to kind of get to these really advanced levels, if it's mainly just hill climbing and kind of like, writing, like making small tweaks to the current basic structure and then just seeing what makes it go better and just following that gradient. Could be. And if so, then there could be really explosive growth in AI capabilities. We can't rule out that, say Daniel Cook-Tuller's 9 months. Yeah, I don't think I can rule out that it could happen in 9 months. In fact, I can't really rule out that it's already happened, like behind closed doors, and I haven't heard about it yet. But I don't think that that's likely. So what I kind of try to say to myself with some of these things is it could well be that we have, say, transformative AI by the end, before the end of the current presidential administration in America. But we probably won't. And so it's important to know that it could happen. And so it could be the current kind of political arrangements is, the arrangements under which it occurs. But I think that it's more likely that they're not. And in which case things could be really quite different. And so that's an example of like how you can kind of like learn from this perspective is that you need to be able to hedge against these early possibilities that happens when we're least prepared, but not like overcommit on them or something. So I worry if companies, say, sacrifice their principles in order to appeal to whoever's currently in charge, or if people in the kind of the broader AI safety community sacrifice their principles to appeal to whichever companies are currently in the lead, or something like that. I think that it's very plausible that things take into the mid-2030s. I think my median date, so my 50% kind of confidence, number, is 2038 for transformative AI, which is what I've been trying to forecast, which I define as like a really big deal. So it's it's somewhere towards superintelligence. I'm thinking AI systems that are so capable that if they wanted to, they could take over the world. So it's the deadline for alignment. And also that they are moving, say, scientific and technological progress twice as fast as it was like prior to that. So that this is, if we zoomed out into human history, this would be a time when it's really happening, as opposed to a time when, I guess they're better than humans at a bunch of things, but they haven't really been kind of, there's only so much compute, though, not enough to run a whole lot of copies. And so I'm kind of thinking of the time when things really are getting going, because I think that the most important role that this plays in people's thinking is like, what's the deadline for getting impact done by? And so I think transformative AI is a kind of way to track that. And so it could well be, I think in the mid or late 2030s or beyond. And if so, then that's many presidential administrations away from now, such as very hard to know whether it would be Democrats or Republicans in power. It's very difficult to know what state America would be in, and whether America is really an ally of Europe and the UK and Australia and other countries, or whether it's gone in some quite different direction, with its threats to invade, Greenland and so on recently. that's quite relevant if one's thinking about building AI for America or something like that, or questions about should a European alternative be something people are investing in. If the timelines are 2 years, then there's no point trying to do it in Europe, right? But if the timelines are 10 years, it could be the most important thing. Or creating a kind of international alternative to a kind of hegemonic national program.
There's also 10 years is a lot of time for China to change its posture and to potentially catch up. I think even people who are relatively bearish on it.
10 years is long enough that the export controls on Chinese chips could well have kind of gone into reverse, where the effective protection that it creates for the native Chinese chip industry may actually have created a big boost to their capacity instead of slowing it down. It could also be the case that Taiwan has been invaded by that point, and if so, then the West may have lost access to this place that's systematically producing chips for them rather than for China, and so could be very different situation in a whole lot of different ways. The architectures of the learning algorithms could be very different. It was only, I think, 9 years ago that we had the transformer was developed. So if we're projecting, another 9 years into the future, in 2035, there could be some other major differences where everyone's using some other weird nonsense word to describe this new architecture that we have no idea about, and it maybe has quite different properties to what we're imagining, and so things could be really different. And another key way is that it's not clear that there will be companies leading the charge at that point. I think that in general, the longer things go on, the more likely it is that there will be national or international projects rather than companies, because people will have realized, if someone just said, I'm interested in creating the successor to Homo sapiens, that is then going to be, more powerful than us in every single way, and not just that, but much more powerful and so on. We wouldn't say, oh, well, let's get a company to do it. It does kind of seem fundamentally crazy. And so that craziness, as we go on, will start to get kind of incorporated into voter preferences and so on, and into, national security postures and so forth, where they start to realize, hang on a second, we can't actually let that happen.
Yeah, I guess they've been allowed to progress with it because nobody believed that it was actually going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
But if they really did think they were right about to do it,
exactly,
they would object.
And so if you kind of have a strategy that's all about the companies, that strategy could well be, start to become somewhat moot or misguided, as we get into a world where they're less likely to be the leading actors. So there's a whole lot of things that could end up really different over these longer time frames. And another kind of key one is the Overton window. Where will, what kinds of policies will be considered reasonable? And I think that also connects to the question of, how likely is it there could be an international treaty between China and the US? If we've seen, AI that's extraordinarily capable, and we've seen kind of some of the crazy stuff that's really done with AI that's, 10 years on from now, it just may not seem at all a stretch that it could take over the world or something else. And so there could be much more appetite for that. If we've got double-digit unemployment rates, in the West, and there's just, marches on the streets, general strikes being called, for people to kind of stop AI, that, completely changes the political landscape, where all of a sudden, we're almost at the situation already to some degree, where politicians who just want to wreck AI, where that could actually be a vote-winning possibility, even if it was just totally unconsidered regulation, that all it did was just, stick it to these AI people who are immiserating the population. We could, one could end up in a situation like that where the incentives are totally different. And instead of how do we get as much safety as possible for as little dampening down of the pace of progress, it could be that damping down the pace of progress is what they're after, and so they're, instead of that being a cost, that's considered another benefit by the politicians. So things could end up very different. In which case, the set of possible interventions could be very different to what they are now. And I think that people, by and large, are really still thinking on very small margins about how do we tweak the current process, by these small amounts. Whereas if it does take a long time, the world just could be so different that the set of available options could be vastly changed.
Yeah, I guess people who are already heavily involved in AI, I think they're very worried about missing the opportunity, missing the window. Doing something that takes 3 years to pay off, and then everything is obviated by then. But I guess you're pointing out that there are some opportunities that might be incredibly impactful that would work if things take 8 years or 12 years to pay out. That might be much more useful than the small margins that people are thinking about over the next couple of years. Because if it takes that long, there could be like really radical cultural change, opinion change, like political change that opens up options that seem completely closed now. And it would be, I guess, a bit crazy to just have nobody working on thinking ahead about what those might be or positioning themselves to take advantage of it.
Exactly.
So yeah, okay.
And we don't even quite know what they all are because there's like so little thought on it. So I feel that, maybe it would be, a good project to even just try to start cataloging, what are the styles of things that the types of things that if we realized that we had 10 years or 15 years or something that we really would have wished that someone spent the time kind of building these things up.
Yeah. I mean, I guess an example, Yoshua Bengio's project, I guess that feels like very sidelined and a bit irrelevant right now. And I guess, if recursive self-improvement works for Anthropic next year, it probably will feel a little bit irrelevant. But you're right, over like 4 or 8 years, if people become like gradually more worried, there's like opportunities to get more funding to attract talent because people think the dominant paradigm is misguided. I don't know how long it would take for that to really pay off.
Yeah, I feel that people are, maybe they're having a bit of this issue of like anticipated regret. Like certainly, suppose I decide to write another book. And I think a book takes about 5 years to pay off from like the moment where you have the idea to like you've kind of got the publishing deal to, you've written the manuscript to the publishers finally got around to printing it, which is literally about a year. And like through to it's actually had enough impact on the world that it was worth it compared to the short-term things you could be doing, which is like another year or so after the date where it comes out. So I think something like 5 years. And if I kind of got to the point where I'd written the manuscript, let's say 3.5 years in, and the publisher's getting around to typesetting it and printing it, and then we hit transformative AI, I'd certainly feel like, oh my god, like,
I really messed up. Yeah, I wish I could go back. And
so the anticipated regret would be huge. But if you actually kind of say, and that could happen to Joshua, right? But if you instead look at the expected value of these things, then I think, it actually is like, oh, we should be taking
50% haircut is just like actually not that big relative to the differences between projects that already exists.
Exactly. And so we need to kind of move out of that, like, is there some chance I like feel like a chump or something? That's not the way there's no like textbook on rationality that says that's how we should make our decisions. But I think that's kind of what's guiding our intuitions a little bit more than sure, it may turn out to, that you missed the boat. But on the other hand, suppose that there's finally appetite for a treaty to delay the development of superintelligence, but it would require
a bunch of groundwork to have been laid.
Yeah, exactly. Or like either a bunch of like diplomatic groundwork or things, but it could also require that there is some kind of alternative approach, some way of kind of getting really high assurance of alignment. And if Joshua's team starts work on that now, such that there's more chance that they've actually got a credible pathway by that point. Maybe they find out the initial approach doesn't work, but they pivot into a second one, and that one has legs. If they've had time to do that, then maybe they can say there is another option, and there's a reason to have like a delay, because if we delay, we'll still be able to get the fruits of this technology in a safe way. Whereas if they don't do that work now, then maybe we come to that opportunity and people decide it's either we get these fruits with a risk or we never get them, and they decide not to delay. So there's a whole lot of things like that.
So the top upvoted comment on your broad timelines piece, actually on multiple different forums, was this reply from Ryan Greenblatt, former guest of the show, great commentator. I guess he was like, I agree with basically what you said in this post, except I don't quite like go towards the conclusion. So I agree with many particular points in this post and the apparent thesis, but also think most people should focus on short timelines, contrary to the apparent implication of the post. The reasons why are short timelines have more leverage, and this isn't just because they're more neglected now, but also because it's easier to target approaches towards shorter timelines where less has changed about the world. Short timelines are riskier. It gives some reasons for that. And 3, it's easier to operate in near mode. I guess it's easier to have like more concrete thoughts about what to do and what will be useful when targeting short timelines. And it's maybe also like more psychologically healthy to try grappling with the world as it is now. And I put sufficiently high probability on short timelines, maybe 25% in under 2.5 years to full AI, R&D automation, and 50% in under 5. That I think focusing on short timelines, and he also expects short times to transfer pretty well and generally not cause much downside. relative to working on longer timelines. What do you think?
Yeah, so my timelines are a bit longer than Ryan's, but Ryan is characteristically correct in basically everything he says, so I agree with lots of those points. In fact, I'm glad you brought them up because I'd maybe focused too much on this haircut possibility that the work you're doing for longer timelines is obviated by something that happens earlier and makes it moot. But he's right that there are additional reasons as well. So that's not enough in your calculation. There's also these aspects about additional leverage in the short timelines. Due to neglectedness, there's fewer people working on it. Due to some of these other questions about concreteness and so on, and that, for example, if you're working on AI safety, maybe you're a bit more likely to go off in some unproductive theoretical direction or something over longer timelines and things. There are a bunch of these additional reasons there. However, they don't apply to everyone. So suppose you're considering a career change, or you're considering a career change, say into government, and what you want to do is work your way up so that you'll be able to have like a senior position on AI in policy making capacity. That's a totally reasonable pathway. And suppose you could get into that position with a high chance, or a substantial chance, let's say 50% chance you get into that position by 2035. I think it sounds like a very reasonable thing to be doing. And you'll have a whole lot of short-term goals as to how to kind of work your way up and through that hierarchy and kind of prove that you know things and that you're a valuable member of the group and so on. So it doesn't kind of fall into quite the same things that if you're a theorist who's working on AI safety, that maybe planning against long timelines, you don't have as much to say. Or if you're someone like Joshua, I think he actually has quite a clear, credible idea that he's going with. And if you said, drop that and come up with a new plan about what you could do in a short time, I just think that would be a mistake. So I think I kind of agree with all of his points. And I think that for certain audiences, each one of them are relevant. But they don't overall say that we should just focus on the shorter timelines.
I guess just different people have very different opportunities available to them.
Yeah.
I guess another one that's occurred to me recently is, as far as I know, there's no organization who takes it as its mission to do research and advocacy and thinking about what are we going to do when there's no work left for humans to do. Mm-hmm. People talk about this in general, but there's no organization that has this figuring out what's the evidence when this is going to happen. What should be the governance reaction? Someone could set that up. It would take many years, I think, to pay off and to build it up into a credible research institute, bring in people who are currently doing that, very scattered. But it would be sad, I think, if no one was willing to do that, because they were well, it will take 3 years to build up something like a meaningful organization. I guess that's just one idea of so many that...
Exactly.
Ryan maybe shouldn't do that because he's currently doing stuff that is really useful quickly.
Exactly. Ryan's doing the right thing and is doing very valuable stuff. And even him posting that comment is, I think, valuable.
Yeah.
But it just turns out that there are a lot of different pathways that different people are considering. Sometimes they've got very strong reason to keep, maybe they've already spent a year trying to work their way up through this pathway and so on. And there's, that's given them a kind of unusually high chance of succeeding. They may well be best off kind of continuing to pursue that longer timeline strategy.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about how good are the models to actually work with. Are they all that they're cracked up to be? On the one hand, I am just super impressed by the models and I use them constantly throughout the workday. I definitely have found, compared to January, I've become a little bit less enthusiastic because I think on the occasions where I've gone and really scrutinized incredibly closely what the model was doing and what it was saying, it always looks worse. I guess that probably would be true with humans as well, but I think it's even more the case with AI is that there's slippages in reasoning and slippages in evidence and some degree of confabulation that just makes it really hard to rely on what they've said wholesale. It's it's a useful input, but not quite as good as what it seemed on the surface when I first started using AIs in this way back in January. Yeah, do you have the same impression? Or
yeah, I haven't run the experiment of really kind of rereading the transcripts. I mean, one thing that you probably also notice is you tend not to read every word that the AI produces, and it partly depends on how much you're when you don't read some stuff, do you assume it got it right? And do you have a kind of pattern you're trying to kind of see there, of it succeeding? And I think I'm probably more in that direction than the opposite, although some people see a pattern where they just assume it's going to fail. I've definitely got a lot of use out of these models as well, including for tasks where I think of them as the following, which is a very kind of academic way of thinking about it, where you've just been to a lecture, and then with someone, and then you go to the pub afterwards, and you're talking about what you just saw, and maybe the person's from a different field, and then they kind of give you some kind of interesting kind of ideas, and you kind of ask, oh, how would that work, in engineering, and they'll tell you some stuff. Or that, you just need some advice from someone in a different discipline. And I think that, it feels like they're about as good as asking a researcher at a good university for over a beer for a bunch of advice on things. Which is to say that when you look back on it, there's at least one out and out error that I can catch. If I talk to these models for an hour about something, I was asking this kind of interesting questions about how high an orbit around the Earth could you have, or do you run into issues if you're trying to orbit kind of somewhere outside the moon's orbit, because as the moon comes around, it disrupts you. Mm-hmm. And I was asking about one of these things that was, I think it was 5 times further out than the moon. And I was asking, does the moon disrupt this? And it said, oh, well, from this distance, the moon has more gravitational pull than the Earth. And I was like, well, that's clearly not true, because the moon's a sixth the diameter of the Earth, and you're 5 times further out than the moon's orbit, and the Earth's just so much bigger. And I was like, are you sure that's right? And it was like, oh, no, actually, it's a 30th as large. I overstated that. It's you didn't just overstate it. You're out and out wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's funny. I was talking to a colleague about this, and I'm saying, yeah, I do find that I can if I talk to it about something, there'll be something like that where even a non-expert in that area is like, well, hang on, what? That doesn't sound right at all. and then you check, and then it's like, oh, no, it wasn't right. And his response was, oh, there's more times than that. You just can't see them.
Yeah.
Because you're asking about an area that's outside your discipline. There's some smallish number of things that even someone from outside the discipline can catch, but there are more mistakes than that, which is a bit alarming. So maybe
especially given how much we're learning to rely on them, just from a prudential point of view. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's not quite as good as the colleague who does kind of they're a bit glib at some point, and they eventually kind of say, oh, I kind of assumed that you wanted me to assume such and such. I didn't realize that you didn't. So I guess my statement wasn't really right. Because even a human colleague will say some things that are wrong.
Blunders sometimes.
And partly because it's just an out and out blunder, and partly because they had a slightly different model of what question you were asking, and they answered the wrong question or something like that. But yeah, I think this made me realize that it could be actually a little bit worse than that still.
Yeah. I've also started to think of them as having the goal of having a glossy report that you will like, that will seem good. And I think they reason about this. They have in their chain of thought, they think about you and they think about what will appeal to you. I think we've managed to tamp down on the outright sycophancy where they're just absolutely blatantly flattering you. But I think it's a bit like a student that's trying to make an essay that sounds good to the teacher who's just scanning over it. So that's another way in which they're a bit weaker than you might think if you just started playing with them briefly. I think probably Fable is less bad in this regard, or actually not on the glossy thing, but I think probably it actually is just a significant step up. But I guess I always am doing this adjustment now, where I don't know how far to adjust. It's such a difficult thing. Is that they're somewhat less impressive than they seem, but is that going to be a persistent thing, or is this just a minor downgrade that's still, or is it a more fundamental problem that they don't have a grasp of reality? They're just kind of speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe all of these things. There's sometimes, we still see from examples of them really making serious mistakes. There was I saw an example recently, which is if an English person says to an American, what would happen if you lift your coffee cup, then the American, what would happen? And there's the classic confusion, because the American will think it's about an elevator. And it's what? No, they won't. So occasionally there's just stuff like that, but that's generally restricted to the really small models, like the the one that happens if you type something to the search box in Google or something. So we see less of those kind of word salady kind of you just what the hell happened there, but there could be still a bit of that. But I like your example about they've kind of got a model of you, and They've been trained to say things that you will find convincing, which is not nice. But that's how a lot of people write. You get taught that in school, how to write a persuasive essay, where effectively you've got a model of the subject and you're trying to convince them of something. I don't want
it's a little adversarial.
Yeah, it is adversarial. I don't want my AI to be attempting to convince me of stuff. I would like it to be laying out the facts and in a way, frankly, that points to its greatest weaknesses and its greatest strengths of the argument that it's just laid out and so on. I don't think it's good at all that it's attempting to
sell you on
to sell me
answer.
on it. Exactly. So I think that is an area where there's that we're going to overestimate it. And another one is that when it comes to tasks without verifiable rewards, and we try to think, how do they train these tasks? One of the ways they hope to get better at that is by transfer from tasks with verifiable rewards. And there has been a little bit of that where it learns some reasoning technique like saying, hang on, wait, let me check that. And then it learns that from the verifiable area like mathematics. And then it starts using those kinds of tricks when it's reasoning about the non-verifiable ones. That's good. I'm not sure there's that much more transfer going on there. But there's also attempts to train them with these LLM as judge approaches where you have, there's no fully verifiable way to kind of sort out how good its answer was, but you could have another language model assess the answer and then give a rating and so on. And if the language model starts off better at assessing the quality of things than it is at creating things, it can kind of piggyback on its discriminative capabilities and turn those into generative capabilities. So you might be quite good at working out whether a novel was written well or not compared to how good you'd be at writing a novel. And so if so, you could use one of these techniques to become better at writing a novel, where you write a whole lot of novels and then you kind of assess them and then you're like, oh, actually,
I should do it more like this.
Yeah, and then you kind of slowly learn and adjust. So that's a clever technique, and that it's produced some value in these non-verifiable areas. But if you think about what goes on there, what does it train for? It trains for things it can detect. And in particular, if there's an out-and-out mistake that it can kind of put its finger on, it teaches it not to do that. And so I've certainly noticed that the outputs of language models on kind of open-ended questions and things are getting harder to kind of point to the fact it's made an out-and-out mistake. But are they actually getting more accurate, or are they getting better at going into some unfalsifiable direction where it's harder to kind of pinpoint that it's made a mistake? It's not clear. And if you look at the theory of what you'd expect, it's kind of oh yeah, I guess I would expect them to be getting a little bit obfuscated and so on.
Basically making it hard to assess the reasoning very clearly, making it harder to spot your own mistakes, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or vague enough that errors are not apparent. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess you're right. Theory would predict that they are becoming like that, and I perceive them as becoming like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I want to go back right at the start of this. You said, they're impressive. I just want to stress that they are genuinely impressive, and occasionally they do things, clearly achieve things which are kind of impressive, and and one shouldn't lose track of that. But by the same token, when you do re-examine it, they're maybe not as good as you thought. And so,
how much of a discount is this on prospects of getting recursive self-improvement or AGI? It's quite hard to assess, because if it is just a thing of they're 20% worse than you think, then you're we'll just wait 3 months and then they will be as good. You know what I mean? Because it's because they're improving so much. You're well, this is only creates a small delay, basically. If it's something more fundamental that they're heading in the wrong direction, they're trending in the wrong direction, and this thing isn't getting fixed because we don't have ways of getting them to be more precise in this respect.
It could be they're trending in the wrong direction. It could be that they're kind of actually plateauing at some kind of intermediate kind of quality that they can't get beyond. Right. That would also be a problem. I think that really a lot of the recursive self-improvement question comes down to this question of, is AI fundamentally hill climbing in a way that you can do with relatively small amounts of insight? That doesn't involve anything if we look at the history of AI, there have been a bunch of really big and original ideas that I would call creative. The idea of connectionism, where we should be, instead of just thinking about logic and the structure of first order logic and reasoning, we should be thinking about a whole lot of little dots with little lines connecting to them, with concepts connected to other concepts and so on, which led to the perceptron, which led to the neural network. That idea that we should throw away all of these logical formulas and instead think about like these dots with like arrows connecting them and so on. That was a pretty big and creative idea, obviously inspired by the brain. Another one is like the idea that you can think of intelligence as compression, that fundamentally to really understand something means that you would be good at expressing it, in as small a way as possible. It's a very deep idea, and it's really not obvious. It's not clear that the current AI systems could come up with stuff like that. And so are we in a world where you need another breakthrough at that kind of level, that kind of creativity, with the kind of thing that comes around like once a decade or something, for the whole research community of AI scientists? If so, there could be a bottleneck. And, our perceiving of looking at these transcripts and kind of noticing that they're slightly tricking us and things would be pretty bad news for them. But if it does turn out that it's just like, no, we've got all of those that we needed. All we need to do now is scale. And maybe there'll be a more efficient way to get there with one of those things. But, with enough scale, we can just get there anyway. If we're in that world, then, that's the kind of world where the RSI may well be quite likely.
To close out, coming back to the broad timelines philosophy, do you think people in the audience, if they want to be working on making AI go better, does broad timelines, to what extent does it imply that each person should be thinking, I should do I want to do something that is like useful across many different possible timelines, something that's useful if it comes in 2030, 2035, 2040? Or does it more imply that we should have a portfolio across like lots of different people, and people should spread out working on different projects that pay out optimally along at different points in time? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, no, I think it's quite a lot more like the second there. So as opposed to that, everyone should just be kind of imagining they're the only actor and they have to kind of like have to address all of these different possibilities. Maybe, a government should be thinking like that, that they need to have policies that would kind of like address these different possibilities. But for an individual, I don't think that's right. I think that the main thing is that they shouldn't be acting as if there's a particular certain timeline that they have to get all their work done by. Instead, there should be a bit of a discount, like a lowering of the value of things that are aimed on, that would pay off over longer timelines, compared to what you'd otherwise think, and a bit of a hedging towards like doing things that hedge against these earlier possibilities. But ultimately, you really do see it at this portfolio level that what we want is that the people who are really good at running in the marathon, the people who have these really great opportunities for like building something much larger than themselves, where they think that they could have 100 times the impact if they were to take 8 years kind of like establishing this thing. We want them to be doing that. We don't want people who are focused on short things to switch into that. And then we want the people who are kind of really well situated to do work now, to keep doing it. And then ideally, some people would take a step back from that and see, are we slightly over-indexed on one of these or the other, where maybe we should direct some people who have equally good options, as to where they go.
My guest today has been Toby Ord. Thanks so much for coming back on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Toby.
It's wonderful. I'm sure I'll be here again.